I sat there motionless, the laughter still echoing across the restaurant as my wife slid the empty prenup folder toward me. My hand trembled around the pen, but I didn't sign, not yet. The waiters pretended not to watch, though their eyes said pity. Across the table, my son smirked, my daughter rolled her eyes, and Laura's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Real men don't cry, Richard. Be a man." Outside, Christmas lights blinked against the glass, warm and mocking. I'd built homes for half the city, but that night, I realized I no longer had one. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The restaurant smelled of oak-grilled steak and expensive wine, one of those places where laughter echoed off marble walls and men in tailored suits debated investments. Richard Hale sat stiff in his chair, his calloused hands folded neatly on the linen napkin. The table gleamed under amber light, silverware aligned like soldiers awaiting command. He'd built half the luxury homes these people dined in, yet tonight he felt like a trespasser in his own life. Laura arrived 10 minutes late, wearing red, the same shade she'd worn when they first met, though now it seemed weaponized. Derek and Chloe trailed behind her, both glowing from the kind of arrogance only youth and ignorance can afford. The maitre d' pulled out their chairs as if they were royalty. Richard gave a polite nod, the old-school kind that meant, "Thank you, even if I don't belong here anymore." Laura didn't waste time with small talk. She unfolded her napkin, dabbed the corner of her lips, and said evenly, "Let's get this over with." Her voice was cool, rehearsed. Derek smirked. Chloe scrolled her phone, pretending not to listen, but she was filming, the camera angled discreetly toward him. The waiter hovered with his practiced smile. "Wine for the table?" Laura lifted her hand. "Cabernet. They're best." "He's paying." Richard's chest tightened, but he nodded once. The waiter left. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut through bone. Then Laura leaned back, eyes gleaming with performance. "I'm filing for separation," she said, loud enough that two nearby tables turned their heads. "This isn't working. You're not the man I married." Derek chuckled into his napkin. Chloe bit her lip, suppressing a grin. Richard swallowed hard. "If this is about money, Laura, we can—" She interrupted. "Money? There is no money. You spent it. Or got sick trying to be the hero who paid everyone else's bills first." Her voice was a knife dipped in honey. Around them, forks paused midair. The waiter froze at the periphery, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Then came the line, soft, cruel, surgical. "Real men don't cry, Dad," Chloe said, mocking gently. "Be a man." Something inside him cracked, but didn't break. Richard's eyes burned, but his face stayed still. He'd been called worse, by life itself. He simply nodded, staring at the candle's flame until it blurred. Laura reached into her designer purse and slid a folder across the table. The gold clasp clicked open like a gun. Inside were photocopies of accounts, zeros where numbers once lived. Even the house deed bore someone else's name. "I had the prenup reviewed," she said, almost bored. "Everything's clean. You keep your truck. I get peace of mind." Richard looked down at the documents, at his own name printed beside empty balances. His throat ached. He thought of the years he spent laying foundations, literal and emotional, while she polished surfaces and smiled for cameras. "Guess you'll need to find a cheaper life," Derek said, smirking. Chloe added softly, "Or maybe finally retire from pretending to be strong." Richard said nothing. Silence was the only power left to him. The waiter returned with the bill on a silver tray. Laura didn't even glance at it. Richard pulled out his last remaining credit card, the one that hadn't yet been declined. The magnetic strip was worn from years of swiping for others. He slid it across, hands steady, though inside he felt hollowed out. The waiter came back moments later, smiling mechanically. "Approved, sir." Laura stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "Don't make a scene, Richard. Crying won't fix it." She turned to Derek and Chloe. "Let's go. We've got reservations at the hotel." They walked away laughing, their reflections fragmenting across the glass wall like ghosts. Richard stayed seated. The restaurant noise faded into a dull hum. He reached for the pen beside the receipt and wrote the only tip he could afford: nothing. Just a long dash and his initials, pressed deep enough to tear the paper. He looked at the total, then at his trembling hand over the empty tip line. The candlelight flickered, catching the moisture at the corner of his eye. He blinked it back, jaw tightening. When he finally stood, the chair legs scraped the floor. A quiet protest. He placed his hand on the table once more, as if steadying himself against the weight of his new reality. Outside, the city glowed like it didn't care. Richard stepped into the cold night air, his reflection ghosting in the window behind him. A man stripped, not broken. And somewhere, under the hum of passing cars, a single thought surfaced, steady and cold. They think I'm finished. He looked up at the sky. We'll see. The echo of hollow footsteps replaced the warmth that once filled the house. Dust floated in shafts of afternoon light, dancing over frame memories that no longer belonged to him. Richard Hale moved slowly, methodically, as if each packed box was a chapter he was sealing shut. The home he'd built with his own hands, every beam, every nail, was now just a stage for his humiliation. In the living room, Laura's voice carried the cold rhythm of detachment. "Make sure you get this side," she said, pointing her phone toward the entryway arch he'd carved 20 years ago. Her manicured finger traced air, not wood. She was filming for Instagram. Angles, filters, the works. "New beginnings," she chirped, smiling for her followers. Richard paused by the mantel where their wedding photo once sat. The spot was empty now, a pale rectangle in the dust, like a scar. Laura's phone camera panned past him, catching his reflection in the mirror, a tired man holding a box labeled kitchen. She smiled into the lens. "Moving on with grace," she said sweetly. Outside, Derek leaned against a new SUV, watching. Chloe stood beside him, thumbs flying over her phone. Within seconds, a notification pinged. Her new post already live. "Bye-bye broke era." The caption glowed through the screen, cruel in its simplicity. Richard didn't react. He carried another box down the front steps, knees stiff, breath heavy. The wood railing was smooth beneath his palm. He'd sanded it himself years ago, thinking one day his grandchildren would run their hands along it too. Now, the house was someone else's prize, bought with his silence. A car slowed near the curb. Mrs. Dalton, the elderly neighbor who'd brought casseroles when his first wife passed, climbed out carefully and shuffled over. Her cardigan flapped in the breeze. "They'll regret this, Rich," she whispered, eyes glistening. "You gave them everything." He set the box gently in the back of his rusted Ford truck and managed a small smile. "Only if I let them," he said. She squeezed his arm, her grip frail but sincere. "You've still got that old fight in you." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. When she left, the silence felt heavier. He looked back at the house, Laura's laughter faintly audible through the open door. For a moment, his jaw tightened. Then he climbed into the truck, turned the key, and the engine coughed to life. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, the sky shifted from gold to gray. Austin's wide streets rolled by, shops, billboards, strangers. None of it caring that one man's entire life had just been boxed up and driven away. His new address sat above a pawn shop, a one-room apartment overlooking the train tracks. The landlord didn't ask questions. The kind look in his eyes said enough. The walls were thin, the floor uneven. When he flipped the switch, one bulb flickered reluctantly to life. He set down his last box, the one marked tools, and stood in the doorway, listening to the faint sound of a train whistle. It was oddly comforting, a steady reminder that movement still existed, that something kept going even when he felt stuck. He opened the window. Cold air swept in, carrying the metallic scent of rain. His eyes landed on the old Ford parked below, paint peeling, mirrors cracked, yet still running. Like him. He sat on the edge of the bed. No headboard, just a mattress and a frame. His wallet was nearly empty. His phone buzzed once. A new post. Laura again, smiling with champagne in hand. Caption: "Freedom feels rich." He turned the phone face down. For a long time, he just stared at the wall. Then, almost involuntarily, a single tear slipped down his cheek. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was the kind that carried weight, grief, exhaustion, the slow burn of humiliation turning into something harder. He reached for the worn leather notebook on the nightstand, its pages yellowed, corners bent from years of disuse. Opening it felt like opening a vein. He clicked his silver pen, the one thing he hadn't pawned, and wrote 2 words across the first page: Plan A. The whistle of another train rose in the distance, deep and steady. He looked toward the sound, his reflection faint in the window glass. The tear had dried now, replaced by something colder. He leaned back, whispering to himself, "Let's see who cries last." The envelope was thinner than he expected, stamped with the fading logo of his old construction company, now little more than a memory buried under bankruptcy filings. Richard sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, a chipped mug of black coffee cooling beside him. He tore the seal slowly, careful not to rip the paper inside, as if the act itself deserved reverence. 2 crisp bills of paper slid out, a check for $2,700, his final severance, the last echo of a career that had built half the suburbs in Travis County. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its small weight. Years of labor distilled into numbers that barely covered 2 months' rent. He laid out the cash allocations the way he used to sketch blueprints, precise, methodical. $800 for rent, $200 for utilities, $1,000 to set aside, emergency only. The last $700, he wrote, coffee, gas. Thought, in his notebook. He smiled faintly at that. Coffee for thought. It was the only luxury he still allowed himself. 1 cup each morning, bitter and grounding, the taste of something still normal. The apartment was silent, except for the low hum of a passing train. He'd grown used to the rhythm now. It reminded him that things still moved, even when he didn't. When the mail slot clattered again that afternoon, he didn't move right away. Most days it was bills or junk flyers for payday loans. But the envelope lying on the floor looked different. Heavy paper, a wax seal, faintly embossed with a name that pulled him upright. Evelyn Parker Law Group, Manhattan. His pulse jumped. Evelyn, his late sister-in-law. She'd been gone only 3 weeks. Heart attack, the obituary said. The woman had been an empire in heels, a venture capitalist whose word could bend markets. She'd also been one of the few who never pitied him, even when the world did. He sat back down and slit the envelope open with his pocket knife. Inside was a letter printed on thick cream stock. The first few lines read, like formality, condolences, acknowledgement of her passing. But then one line caught him, sharp and out of place. You are named in her preliminary trust. He read it again, slowly, his lips moving around the words, as if saying them might make them real. You are named in her preliminary trust. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Probably a mistake, he muttered. Evelyn had been worth billions, and she surrounded herself with innovators, CEOs, people who turned ideas into gold, not washed-up builders scraping rent together in Austin. Still, he couldn't shake the small flicker of curiosity. He reread the letter, but there were no details, just an invitation to confirm his address for future correspondence. He folded it carefully and placed it beside the check. The 2 papers looked absurd together, one representing everything he'd lost, the other, maybe, something else entirely. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, listening to the trains, the apartment breathing quietly around him. The letter sat on the nightstand under the glow of the streetlight, the wax seal glinting faintly. Evelyn Parker. He remembered her laughter at family dinners, the way she'd once told him, "You build with integrity, Richard. That's rarer than profit." He'd almost forgotten those words. The next morning, as sunlight crept across the room, his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number flashed across the cracked screen, New York area code. He let it ring once, twice, before answering. A calm voice spoke. "Mr. Hale, this is Sam Ortiz. I was Evelyn Parker's attorney." Richard's breath caught. He sat up straighter. "Yes, I got your letter." Sam's tone was measured, warm but direct. "Good. I wanted to confirm you received it. Evelyn left some instructions. We'll need to speak further about her estate." Richard frowned. "I think there's been some mix-up. I can't imagine—" "Mr. Hale," Sam interrupted gently, "Evelyn doesn't make mistakes." The line clicked softly as the call ended. Richard stared at his phone, the faint buzz of the disconnected signal humming in his ear. Outside, another train passed, rattling the window pane. The coffee on his table had gone cold, but his pulse hadn't. He looked toward the folded letter, its seal half open, as if waiting. For the first time in months, Richard didn't feel empty. He felt alert. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure yet what. The morning began gray, the kind of Texas dawn that blurred the line between night and day. Richard Hale sat at his kitchen table, a second cup of coffee cooling beside the newspaper he wasn't reading. The letter from Evelyn Parker's law firm still rested near the window, its corners curling slightly from the humidity. He'd almost convinced himself it meant nothing, some clerical error, a wrong Richard Hale, maybe a forgotten mailing list. Then the phone rang again, same New York area code. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button before finally pressing it. "Mr. Hale?" The voice was familiar now, calm, deliberate, with a trace of warmth. "Sam Ortiz again." "Yes," Richard said, cautious. "I got your message." "Good. I wanted to explain a few things," Sam continued. "Evelyn Parker admired your honesty. She spoke highly of you often." Richard exhaled slowly. "She was worth billions, Sam." "Yes," Sam replied without hesitation, "and she meant it when she said integrity was rarer than wealth. That's why she left instructions." "Instructions?" "There are no heirs yet," Sam said. "Not officially. Evelyn's estate isn't about inheritance. It's about worthiness. She wanted someone who still builds." Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall. "Build?" he repeated quietly. "Build what? I've got nothing left to build with." Sam's tone softened. "She didn't mean buildings necessarily. She meant a life worthy of investment. Her words, not mine." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Outside, a train rumbled past, the vibrations trembling through the floorboards. Build a life worthy of investment. The phrase lingered like an unfinished line in one of his old blueprints. "Look, Sam," Richard said finally, rubbing a hand over his face. "I appreciate this, but I'm not some charity case. I've lost my company, my home, my—" He stopped himself. "Whatever Evelyn saw in me was years ago." Sam didn't argue. "Then prove her right again." The line went quiet, just the faint hum of distance between them. Then Sam added, "I'll send over the first packet. There are phases to her trust. Let's just say your next step depends on what you choose to do now." Before Richard could respond, the call ended. He sat there for a while, staring at the dead phone screen. He could almost hear Evelyn's voice in the back of his mind, sharp, witty, unwavering. "You build things, Richard. That's what you do when the world breaks you." He reached for the silver pen sitting beside his coffee mug, the one thing he hadn't pawned. The metal felt cool against his fingers. Slowly, almost without realizing it, He dragged a napkin across the table and began to draw. First came straight lines, intersecting angles, foundations, walls, roof lines, then numbers. His hand steadied with each stroke. It wasn't habit, it was instinct, muscle memory from decades of creation. Before long, he was sketching a compact layout, affordable, practical, efficient, a small home that could be built on a veteran's pension, sturdy enough to last. When he looked at it, he saw possibility again, something human, something that mattered. He stayed up most of the night, drawing by lamplight. Piles of napkins turned into blueprints. The tiny apartment began to look like an architect's workshop. Coffee cups gathered in clusters like silent witnesses. The next day, he found himself at the Austin Public Library, flipping through zoning laws, construction codes, and funding programs. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman with reading glasses, asked if he needed help. "Not yet," he said with a faint smile. "Just building something in my head." Hours passed. He filled pages with notes, cost estimates, labor calculations, material substitutions. Every stroke of the pen seemed to rebuild a piece of him. At one point, he paused to stretch, realizing he hadn't eaten since morning. He glanced at the city skyline through the tall windows, the cranes, the half-finished condos, and felt something familiar stir beneath the grief. Not pride, not hope exactly, determination. That evening, back in his apartment, he pinned the napkin sketches to the wall. The cheap plaster barely held the tape, but it didn't matter. He stepped back and looked at them, 20 different outlines of small homes, all practical, all beautiful in their own way. For the first time since his family had walked out, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. He sat at the table again, pen in hand, and drew one more line across the page. Beneath it, he wrote 3 words in careful block letters. Phase 1, proof. He didn't know what Evelyn's plan truly was, or what Sam expected him to build, but he knew this much. Grief had to make room for motion. Richard leaned back, eyes fixed on the growing constellation of sketches taped to the wall. The night hummed around him, quiet but alive. Outside, another train wailed through the darkness, as if echoing something inside him. He whispered under his breath, "All right, Evelyn, let's see what you had in mind." The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and old varnish, the kind of scent that clings to rooms where too many lives have been divided. Richard Hale sat at the defendant's table, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Across from him, Laura looked radiant under the fluorescent lights, hair perfectly curled, lips tinted in victory red, wearing a designer dress that shimmered when she shifted in her chair. She didn't look like a woman mourning a marriage. She looked like someone attending an awards ceremony. The judge droned through the paperwork in a tone drained of empathy. Division of property as per prenuptial agreement. The house, located at 312 Oakwood, awarded to Mrs. Hale. Alimony, monthly, as outlined. Each word struck like a quiet hammer. Richard didn't flinch. He'd already buried the shock weeks ago, back at that restaurant where humiliation had tasted like steak and cheap wine. Now there was only stillness. Laura glanced over, a faint smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. It wasn't joy. It was confirmation. The kind of expression that said, "I've won, and you won't fight me for it." The judge looked toward Richard. "Do you contest any of these terms, Mr. Hale?" He shook his head. "No, Your Honor." His voice was low, steady, controlled. The pen scratched across the final page, his signature a quiet surrender written in black ink. The sound filled the room like the soft click of a closing door. When the papers were collected, Laura rose gracefully, smoothing her dress. Chloe followed, her heels tapping the tile in impatient rhythm. As they passed his table, she leaned close enough for only him to hear. "Don't cry, Dad," she whispered with a smirk. "Remember the rule." The rule. Real men don't cry. It echoed in his chest like a cruel mantra, one he hadn't made, but had somehow been sentenced to live by. He looked up at her for a moment, not angry, not pleading, just silent. Then he turned away. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick with rain. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds rumbling in gray layers. He didn't have an umbrella, and he didn't care. The rain came down hard, cold against his face, mixing with the salt already there. It was a mercy, nature's way of disguising weakness. He walked slowly toward the parking lot, the papers sealed in a manila envelope under his arm. Around him, the city kept moving, people rushing past, taxis splashing puddles. But for him, the world had narrowed to the rhythm of water hitting concrete. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A single text from Sam Ortiz. "Keep receipts. Everything's temporary." Richard read it twice, lips tightening into something almost like a smile. There was a strange comfort in the words, proof that someone still believed his story wasn't over. He slipped the phone back into his coat and stood beneath the awning for a moment, staring at the courthouse steps he'd just climbed down. Lightning cracked across the sky, sharp, white, decisive. The thunder followed seconds later, rolling deep and long. For an instant, the flash illuminated his reflection in the glass doors behind him. Wet hair, lined face, eyes steady. The storm didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like clarity. He took a slow breath, the kind you take when something inside you finally shifts from grief to resolve. Then he stepped off the curb, the rain swallowing his figure as he walked toward the parking lot where his old Ford waited, its metal roof pinging softly under the downpour. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't look back. The storm followed him down the road, lightning trailing in the distance like a promise. The pawn shop smelled of old metal and regret. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering just enough to remind Richard Hale how far he'd fallen from the polished offices he used to walk through. Rows of guitars, cameras, and dusty tools sat behind glass, people's stories reduced to price tags. He stepped up to the counter carrying a small box. The clerk, a heavy-set man with inked forearms, glanced inside. "You selling or pawning?" "Pawning," Richard said quietly. Out came the items, his wedding ring first. The gold looked dull now, its engraving nearly worn smooth. He turned it once between his fingers before setting it down. Then his wristwatch, scratched, mechanical, a gift from Laura back when love still meant something. Last came a small set of construction tools, handles worn smooth by years of use. The clerk scribbled numbers on a form. "For all this, I can give you maybe 500. Richard nodded. "That'll do." The man slid a thin pawn ticket across the counter. Richard took it, folded it once, and slipped it into his wallet next to his driver's license. One identity stacked atop another. As he turned to leave, his reflection caught in the glass case. Hollow eyes, a lined face, a man stripped to essentials. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the one thing he hadn't pawned, a silver pen engraved with his initials, his father's. It had survived decades of moves, jobs, and heartbreak. Some things weren't worth money. They were worth meaning. Back in his truck, rain misted the windshield. He sat there for a while, hands on the steering wheel, letting the quiet press in. Then he reached for his worn leather notebook and wrote slowly in neat, deliberate strokes. Dignity accrues interest. He underlined the words twice. It wasn't just a note, it was a vow. Days turned into weeks. Richard picked up small jobs wherever he could, hauling supplies for construction crews, patching drywall, clearing sites after storms. The men on those crews were half his age, their laughter loud and careless. But they respected how he worked, steady, wordless, efficient. He didn't talk much, but every time his hands gripped a hammer or measured a line, something inside him steadied. Sweat replaced sorrow. Motion replaced memory. He'd built for others his entire life. Now, he was rebuilding himself, one plank at a time. What Richard didn't know, couldn't know was that someone was watching. Across town, in a quiet Manhattan office, Sam Ortiz scrolled through digital updates from a private investigator hired to monitor the early phases of Evelyn Parker's trust. A single photo stood out. Richard, bent over a foundation, shirt soaked through, his silver pen clipped to his collar. Sam smiled faintly. "Still building," he murmured. Austin's autumn heat bled into winter. Work slowed, but Richard didn't stop. Every check went to rent and savings. No luxuries, no waste. Nights were spent at the small desk by his window, sketching designs under the buzz of a lamp. He didn't need applause. He needed momentum. One evening, scrolling through his phone for construction leads, he saw a familiar face. Laura, sunlit, tanned, glass of champagne in hand. The caption read, "In freedom feels." Rich. For a moment, the air left his chest. Her smile was effortless, the same one she'd worn when she told him he wasn't enough. He studied the post carefully, the luxury resort behind her, the reflection of Derek's car in the glass railing, Chloe laughing somewhere off frame. He set the phone down slowly. The old ache was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He reached for his pen again, holding it between his fingers, the way his father once had when signing his first business contract. He looked out at the city lights and whispered, "We'll test that." The words weren't angry, they were calm, deliberate, like blueprints being drawn in his mind. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. The morning began like any other. Quiet, gray, unremarkable. Richard Hale sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, the steam curling upward into the cold light of day. The trains had already passed twice, their low rumble marking time like a clock he didn't set anymore. The calendar on the wall still showed last month. He hadn't bothered to turn the page. Then came the knock, 3 short taps against the metal door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened it to find a postal carrier holding a small, flat envelope. Registered mail. The man asked for a signature. Richard scribbled his name, thanked him, and shut the door. The return address read, Evelyn Parker Trust, Manhattan office. His breath hitched slightly. Phase 2. He sat down, the envelope balanced in his rough, calloused hands. For a moment, he didn't move, just stared at it, weighing the silence that followed. Then, with the slow precision of habit, he slid a knife beneath the seal. Inside, wrapped in formal letterhead, were 3 items: a key card, a plane ticket to New York City, and a handwritten note from Sam Ortiz. The penmanship was clean, confident, like Evelyn's once had been. Your project pitch determines distribution. Phase 2 begins now. No further instructions, no explanation. Just a challenge written between the lines. Richard leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Your project pitch determines distribution. The phrase looped in his head, sharp and deliberate. This wasn't charity, it was a test. Evelyn had built empires on merit, not mercy. She wanted proof, not tears. He glanced around his apartment. The sketches he'd pinned along the wall fluttered slightly from a draft, the blueprints of affordable homes for veterans, hand-drawn in pencil and coffee stains. They weren't much, but they were real, tangible, honest. He took one last sip of cold coffee, then reached for his worn blazer hanging on the back of the chair. The fabric was threadbare, elbows shiny from years of use, but it was the only one he had that still carried his shape. He folded it carefully into a duffel bag along with his silver pen, his notebook, and a single change of clothes. As he zipped the bag, there was a soft knock on the door frame. Mrs. Dalton, his elderly neighbor, peeked in with her familiar warm smile. "Heading somewhere, Rich?" she asked, noticing the bag at his feet. He gave her a small nod. "Business trip," he said. Then after a pause, he corrected himself, voice steady, low. "Correction trip." She chuckled softly, though she didn't quite understand. "Well, you show them what you're made of." "I intend to," he said, locking the door behind him. Outside, the air felt cleaner than usual. the kind that carried promise. He climbed into his old Ford truck, the same one that had witnessed his downfall, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before settling into a rough idle. He drove toward the airport with steady hands, the ticket envelope resting on the passenger seat like a quiet secret. Inside the terminal, people rushed past in waves, families, businessmen, lovers. He hadn't flown in years. The last time he'd boarded a plane, Laura was beside him, laughing at the flight attendant's jokes. Now, it was just him and a one-way ticket to Manhattan. He found a seat near the large departure board, the bright letters flickering across the screen. Austin, New York City, on time. Richard's eyes tracked the movement of destinations: Paris, Denver, Los Angeles, each one a story, a path. But his was different. His flight wasn't about distance, it was about confrontation, about rebuilding something the world had told him was finished. He reached into his jacket pocket, touched the smooth surface of the key card, and closed his fist around it. The symbol of entry, literal and otherwise. Evelyn's way of saying the door's open, but you still have to earn your way through it. As the boarding call echoed overhead, Richard stood. The terminal lights gleamed against the glass, reflecting a man who no longer looked broken, just sharpened. He picked up his bag and stepped toward the gate. In the background, faintly, the sound of strings swelled, a suspenseful undertone rising beneath the hum of engines and chatter, like the world holding its breath. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, releasing Richard Hale into a corridor lined with glass and silence. Manhattan stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, towers of steel and money scraping the clouds. His thrift store blazer looked out of place here, the sleeves slightly short, the shoes scuffed clean but old. He took a breath, straightened his tie, and followed Sam Ortiz down the hall. "Don't let the room fool you," Sam murmured as they walked. "They test more than ideas in there." Richard nodded. "I've been tested before." The conference room was a fortress of wealth. A dozen trustees sat around a long mahogany table, each one a portrait of power, tailored suits, manicured hands, expressions carved in quiet judgment. Their watches alone could buy the house he'd lost. Sam made the introductions. "Gentlemen and ladies, this is Richard Hale, Evelyn Parker's nominee for review." A murmur rippled through the group. One man leaned back, whispering something that made another smirk. A woman in pearls glanced at Richard's worn briefcase like it might stain the table. Richard heard it all, but reacted to none of it. He simply set his case down, opened it, and began pulling out a stack of neatly bound sketches, charts, and cost breakdowns, drawn by hand, not printed. One of the trustees, a sharp-faced man named Conway, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, I assume you understand the scale of this meeting? Evelyn's trust handles portfolios in the billions. What exactly do you intend to build?" Richard looked him dead in the eye. "Homes," he said simply. A few chuckles followed, quiet and condescending. Conway leaned forward. "Homes, Mr. Hale?" "Affordable ones," Richard continued, his voice steady. "For veterans, people who gave their hands, their backs, their futures, and came home to nothing but rent they can't pay." The laughter faded. He laid the first sketch flat on the table, a clean blueprint of a modular house. Compact, energy efficient, sustainable. "These can be built for under $110,000 each, including materials. No corners cut. I've built my whole life. I know it lasts." He pointed to the next page. Charts, estimates, zoning maps. Every number lined up, every figure justified. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's return on dignity. Veterans pay reduced mortgage rates based on work hours contributed to the build. They invest sweat equity, not handouts." The room was still now. Richard looked around, his gaze firm but calm. "Evelyn used to say money should build something that outlives it. I took her literally." One trustee leaned in. "You did all this yourself?" Richard nodded once. "No investors, no team, just a pen, a notebook, and a reason." The air shifted. Even Conway, the skeptic, tapped his pen against the folder, subtle, thoughtful. Sam sat quietly at the far end, watching with the faintest trace of a smile. When Richard finished, he closed the folder and stepped back. "That's my proposal. Build something that gives people a foundation, literally and figuratively." No applause followed, just silence. The kind that meant calculation, the kind that decided fates. Finally, the chairwoman spoke. "We'll review the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Hale." He nodded, gathered his papers, and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Sam rose too, falling into step beside him. Once they were out in the hall, Richard exhaled for the first time in an hour. Sam clapped him gently on the shoulder. "You passed." Richard blinked. "Just like that?" Sam's grin was small but sure. Evelyn didn't want showmen. She wanted builders. They saw it. Downstairs, in the lobby, Sam handed him a sealed envelope. "Phase 1 allocation," he said. $3 million in seed capital. Use it right and it becomes more. Use it wrong." He let the sentence hang. Richard took the envelope, its weight far heavier than the paper suggested. 3 million. Enough to build. Enough to tempt. Outside, the city roared with life. Cars, sirens, ambition. He looked up at the skyline where glass towers glittered against the sun. A storm was forming inside him. Power meeting purpose. Ambition touching danger. He whispered to himself, "Let's see if money builds character too." The first article hit the local Austin Chronicle at dawn. Headline in bold black print, "Retired builder gets surprise investment from New York Trust." Beneath it, a grainy photo of Richard Hale in a hard hat, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused on a set of blueprints. The image wasn't posed. It was captured from a distance, mid-motion, real, gritty, human. By noon, the story had already spread across social feeds and news aggregators. Reporters loved the angle, the bankrupt builder who got a second chance. Comment sections filled with strangers arguing whether it was luck, legacy, or karma. But one detail caught everyone's attention: the $3 million grant. Across town, in a sunlit bistro lined with glass and laughter, Laura Hale lifted her mimosa mid-sentence. Her eyes froze on the phone screen. There it was, Richard's name. Her hand stopped halfway to her lips. Chloe sat opposite her, oversized sunglasses perched atop her head, brunch fork hovering over avocado toast. "What's wrong, Mom?" Laura didn't answer. She tilted the phone toward her daughter. Chloe read the headline out loud, her tone dismissive at first. "Retired builder gets surprise investment," then faltered. "Wait, Richard Hale?" The silence between them thickened. Laura's knuckles whitened around the stem of her glass. "It's clickbait," she said finally, though the conviction sounded forced. Chloe scrolled quickly. "No, Mom, it's real. There's a quote here. Hale's proposal for affordable veteran housing has received initial approval and funding." "That's him. Dad." A laugh slipped out, high and nervous. "Maybe it's another Richard Hale." But it wasn't. The photo confirmed it. The same man they'd watched crumble, the one who'd walked out of that steakhouse with nothing but silence in his defense. At another table nearby, Derek noticed his sister's tone. "What are you two?" He reached for the phone, eyes narrowing as he read. The article was detailed, full of admiration for Richard's innovation and heart. $3 million, he muttered. "From Evelyn Parker's trust?" Chloe looked up. "Wasn't she—" "Yes," Laura interrupted sharply. "His late sister-in-law. Evelyn always had a soft spot for him, probably charity." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Evelyn Parker didn't believe in sympathy, only merit. Her chest tightened. "How the hell did he pull this off?" Derek kept scrolling. "Says here he pitched some new housing model, efficient design, sustainable materials. Investors are calling it revolutionary." Laura laughed bitterly. "Revolutionary? He couldn't even fix a leaky faucet without calling in help." Yet her voice wavered, because deep down, She remembered who Richard really was. The man who built their first home with his own hands, who used to measure every plank twice and stay up nights calculating costs so she'd never see the struggle. She'd called him old-fashioned. Maybe she was wrong. Across the city, in a small rented workspace lined with blueprints and coffee-stained napkins, Richard was too busy to notice the media frenzy. The radio on the counter played softly, a reporter's voice mentioning his name, but he barely looked up. His pencil moved steadily across the drafting table, marking cost revisions and roof angles. Every so often, he'd pause to check material prices online, jotting down alternatives in the margins. The $3 million wasn't wealth, it was trust. It demanded precision. On the wall above him, the newspaper headline had already been printed out and pinned next to his sketches. He hadn't put it there. Sam had. Motivation, his friend had said. Richard didn't see fame or vindication in that photo of himself, just accountability. The world was watching now. That meant no mistakes. But outside his bubble of focus, the internet was doing what it always did, building myths. The photo of Richard in the hard hat began circulating across social media. Captions called him the builder who didn't give up, and real men rebuild. Strangers wrote comments like, "Finally, a good man gets what he deserves." The sentiment shifted overnight. The man once mocked as weak became a symbol of quiet strength. In one viral clip, a commentator said, "You can't fake dignity, that man earned it." By evening, Laura scrolled through her phone again. The same picture, his calm half-smile, dirt on his hands, filled every feed. She turned off her screen, her reflection dark in the glass window of the bistro. Somewhere beneath the annoyance, something unfamiliar twisted in her gut. Fear, maybe. Back in his workspace, Richard stood alone under the dim light, checking measurements one last time before locking up. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the windows. He slipped the silver pen back into his pocket and whispered to himself, "Now it begins." The sun was barely up over Manhattan, painting the skyline in streaks of pale orange and steel blue. Richard Hale stood by the window of his small office, coffee cooling in his hand, reviewing the latest construction estimates pinned across the wall. The new foundation had been poured the day before, solid, measured, perfect. For the first time in years, his life felt as stable as the concrete he'd built his name on. The phone buzzed on his desk. Unknown number, Austin area code. He hesitated. It could have been a supplier or a ghost from his old life. He answered anyway. "Hale." A pause, then her voice. "Richard, it's me. Laura." Her tone carried that familiar blend of sweetness and control, polished for years of social climbing and dinner parties. "I heard you're doing okay," she said, dragging the words like she was tasting something she didn't quite believe. Richard set the mug down slowly. "Doing okay?" He looked at the framed site photo on the wall, rows of veteran housing units taking shape under the Texas sun. "I'm building foundations again," he said evenly. She laughed softly. "That sounds nice. You always did love your projects." He could picture her now, probably sitting in her modern kitchen, glass of white wine nearby, even though it was still morning in Austin. A phone camera, ready to capture just the right angle if she needed to post another curated moment of her healing journey. "So," she continued, "I was thinking maybe we should talk. It's been months and—" He cut in gently. "About what, Laura?" There was a tiny catch in her breath, the sound of someone not used to being interrupted. "About everything. About us." "Us?" He smiled faintly. Didn't the judge already define what us means? Her silence was thin but sharp. Then came the pivot, predictable as a rehearsed script. "I just think maybe we rushed things. People change, Richard. Maybe we could meet, talk things through." Richard walked toward his drafting table, eyes scanning over the penciled lines of his latest design. A home with open floor plans, adaptable walls, built for resilience. His fingertips brushed over the blueprint as he replied, "Sure, Laura." The warmth in her voice returned instantly. "Really?" "Of course," he said, "once it's structurally safe." There was a pause, a confused inhale. What does that mean?" "It means I don't start rebuilding until the ground stops shifting." His voice stayed calm, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. "You remember how foundations work, right?" Her tone faltered, something brittle cracking beneath the charm. "Richard, I didn't call for metaphors. I just thought—" He didn't let her finish. "You thought wrong," he said, his words measured like the swing of a hammer. "You wanted to talk when I was broken, to prove you'd won. Now you're calling because you can't tell which way the wind's blowing. I'm not a forecast, Laura, I'm construction." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the background, he could hear the faint hum of her refrigerator, the quiet luxury of her comfort. Then came the tiniest tremor in her voice. "You've changed." He looked out the window again, at the skyline of New York, steel, concrete, effort, and endurance. "No," he said softly. "I just stopped apologizing for who I am." Laura's tone cooled instantly, the performance back in place. "Fine, I was only trying to be civil. Enjoy your foundations." The line clicked dead before he could answer. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. The phone still buzzed faintly in his hand, her name lingering on the screen for a heartbeat before fading to black. Richard turned back to his desk, picked up his silver pen, and marked another adjustment on the project's cost ledger. His movements were unhurried, steady, the way a craftsman builds, not to impress, but to endure. Outside, the wind shifted against the tall glass windows, and a low rumble of distant thunder rolled over the city. He glanced at the skyline, half smiling to himself. "Storm's coming," he murmured. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. The morning sun hung low over the open land outside Dallas, a field that used to be nothing but scrub and silence. Now it buzzed with life, trucks rumbling, machines humming, men shouting directions through the dust. A banner stretched across the temporary fencing. Hale Housing Initiative, building foundations that last. Richard Hale stood in the center of it all, hard hat tucked under one arm, clipboard in hand. He wasn't barking orders or waving arms like some foreman desperate for control. His authority came from stillness, the quiet certainty of a man who'd rebuilt himself brick by brick. The younger workers watched him carefully, mimicking his calm precision. Even the loudest among them lowered their voices when he walked past. "Measure twice," he said evenly, pointing to a trench line. "If the foundation's off an inch, the roof will show it 10 years from now." "Yes, sir," one of the crewmen replied, adjusting the chalk line immediately. Sam Ortiz stepped out of a black SUV nearby, sleeves rolled up, phone pressed to his ear. He finished his call and approached, grinning. "You've got half of Dallas watching, you know that? Local channels, blogs, even a few national outlets. They love this story." Richard glanced toward the road. A camera crew had indeed arrived, setting up tripods near the fence. "Let them film," he said. "We've got nothing to hide." Sam nodded approvingly. "Transparency suits you. I've been managing the accounts. Every cent is accounted for, just like you wanted. But I'll tell you this, Rich. The banks are sniffing around now. They're not used to seeing this much progress without debt." "Then let them wonder," Richard replied, eyes fixed on the workers, leveling concrete. "We're not selling a product. We're building proof." By noon, the site pulsed with rhythm, cement mixers turning, drills whining, the smell of steel and sweat thick in the air. Richard walked among the workers, answering questions, shaking hands, sketching quick solutions on scraps of lumber. He didn't need an office. His desk was wherever progress was being made. Then, in the distance, a sleek black SUV turned off the highway and rolled slowly toward the site. Even before the dust cleared, Richard knew. Laura. The vehicle stopped near the media tent. Doors opened. Out stepped Laura Hale in heels far too delicate for construction ground, trailed by a cameraman and a woman holding a boom mic. Her sunglasses caught the sun like mirrors, reflecting everything but remorse. Sam muttered, "Oh, she did not just bring a film crew." Richard didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his hard hat and walked toward her. "Richard," she called, voice sweet but sharpened. "I hope I'm not intruding. I heard about your project. Thought I'd see it for myself." "You brought press," he said. She laughed softly, waving a manicured hand. "Oh, them? Just documenting a human interest piece. You know how it is." The workers slowed, watching the scene unfold. Cameras swiveled toward them. Richard's voice carried just enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "Everyone," he said, turning to the crew and reporters alike, "this is Laura Hale, my past investor. Short-term yield." For a heartbeat, the site went silent. Then came the chuckles, low, rolling, impossible to contain. Even the camera operator bit his lip to keep from smiling. Laura's face stiffened, her practiced charm cracking around the edges. "That's cute," she said flatly, tugging her sunglasses off. Richard's expression didn't change. "It's accurate." Sam, standing a few feet away, nearly choked, trying to hide his grin. Laura turned on her heel, muttering something to her cameraman. "We're done here." But before she reached the SUV, a nearby reporter called out, "Mrs. Hale, any comment on your ex-husband's success story?" She froze, then forced a smile toward the camera. "I'm happy for him, really. It's inspiring." Her voice trembled just enough for everyone to hear the lie. The SUV door slammed, tires spinning gravel as she drove off. When the dust settled, Richard exhaled through his nose, calm and composed. The crew broke into small, knowing laughs, their respect for him deepening wordlessly. Sam leaned over. "Well," he said, "that might have just bought you another front-page feature." Richard gave a quiet nod. "Good. Let them print the truth this time." He walked back toward the half-built foundations, the late daylight catching the grit on his hands. Reporters circled, cameras rolling, narrating the moment as the man once humiliated now directed the building of homes that would outlast the gossip. But under that calm, something deeper stirred, a new momentum, sharper and colder. Revenge, no longer reactive, but strategic. As the sun dipped low behind the cranes, Richard looked out over the rising framework and whispered, "Let's keep building." The cracks began quietly, small, almost invisible. First, one of Chloe Hale's brand sponsorships pulled out, citing reputational inconsistencies. Then another. Within weeks, her inbox turned from offers to apologies. A makeup brand delayed payments. A fitness company ended its contract outright. Her follower count started dipping, 1,000 at a time. She tried to cover it up, new filters, motivational captions, fake laughter in her stories, but the comments had changed tone. "Didn't your dad fund your old house? Funny how karma works. Guess Real Men Don't Cry wasn't great PR." Chloe scrolled through them late one night, her reflection ghosted across her screen. "They're just jealous," she whispered, though her voice cracked. Her credit card bills told another story. Designer purchases, unpaid taxes, a luxury life built on borrowed applause. Across the city, Derek's fall was faster. His condo, paid for with what little inheritance Laura had managed to keep, was foreclosed after months of missed payments. The eviction notice hit him like a slap. His friends stopped answering calls once they realized the tab wasn't on him anymore. Now he sat in Laura's kitchen, head in his hands, while Chloe paced in circles, voice sharp and desperate. "You're supposed to be the one who handles money, Derek," he snapped back. "And you were supposed to be the one with influence. Where's that getting us now?" Laura slammed her coffee cup down, splattering it across marble. "Enough, both of you." For the first time in years, her tone carried no control, just exhaustion. "You think I'm swimming in cash? Lawyers bled me dry after that divorce." Then what do we do? Chloe asked, voice trembling. Laura hesitated. Then softly, we ask your father. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Derek's jaw dropped. You're kidding. He has money now, she said, each word tasting bitter. You've seen the news, the trust, the projects. He's practically famous again. Chloe folded her arms. After everything we said? After the way we treated him? Laura sighed, looking down. People forgive when they're winning. He might help us if we show remorse. By morning, she had his number again, saved under Richard H. The call rang 3 times before he answered. Laura. His tone was calm, unreadable. She cleared her throat. The kids, they're struggling. Maybe it's time we all sat down, talked things through. A long pause. Then his voice came through, quiet but steady. You know what, Laura? That sounds right. Relief bloomed in her chest. Really? I'll send tickets, he said. Family meeting, New York. When she hung up, Chloe's eyes were wide. He said yes? Yes, Laura said, almost smiling. He said family meeting. They didn't see the faint smile on the other end of the call. 2 days later, Manhattan glittered beneath a sharp blue sky. Inside the glass tower of the Parker Trust offices, Sam Ortiz leaned against a desk, watching Richard straighten his tie in the reflection of the window. They think it's reconciliation, Sam said. I know. Sam raised an eyebrow. You sure you're ready for this? Richard's voice carried no hesitation. Always. Sam reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, heavy with embossed lettering. The label across the front read, Evelyn Parker Trust, Phase 3, $280 million. The number itself looked unreal, almost absurd, until you remembered who Evelyn Parker was. Richard took the envelope and placed it carefully inside his jacket. Let's see who still believes in foundations, he said quietly. Sam's expression softened. You're not the same man they left. No, Richard said. I'm the man they built by accident. Outside, the city traffic pulsed like a heartbeat. The elevator chimed in the distance. Someone arriving. Sam turned toward the door. That'll be them. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled slowly. Somewhere beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, a faint string of music seemed to rise. Ominous, measured, inevitable. The elevator opened directly into the top floor of the Parker Trust headquarters, a penthouse wrapped in glass and skyline. Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath it, a sea of light and power. Richard Hale stepped out first, the sound of his shoes muted against the marble floor. Behind him, Laura, Chloe, and Derek followed, their eyes wide as they took in the view. This is impressive, Laura whispered, running her fingers along the polished conference table that seemed to float above the city. Sam Ortiz stood at the far end of the room beside a panel of trustees, 5 men and women in sleek suits, their expressions measured and professional. On the table sat a set of folders, a notary pad, and a glass box containing a single document embossed with a gold seal. Mr. Hale, the chairwoman said, her voice echoing slightly. Thank you for coming. We're here to finalize Phase 3 of the Parker Trust. Richard gave a short nod. I'm ready. Laura stepped forward, a smile practiced for cameras. I'm sure this is all just a formality, she said sweetly. Evelyn was such a generous woman. I'm glad Richard could be part of her charitable vision. Sam glanced at her, unimpressed. Mrs. Hale, this isn't charity. It's fulfillment of instruction. The words hung in the air like a slow, cold wind. Chloe leaned toward Derek. What's he talking about? Derek shrugged, but his eyes stayed on the folders, suspicion creeping in. The chairwoman folded her hands. Per Evelyn Parker's final directive, the trustees have unanimously agreed to transfer full ownership of the Parker estate and assets. valued at $280 million, to Richard Hale. The silence that followed was seismic. Then came the sound of Laura's sharp intake of breath. "That's insane," she blurted out. "You can't be serious." Her voice echoed across the glass walls, bouncing back at her like accusation. Chloe's jaw dropped. Derek just stared at Richard as if seeing him for the first time. Richard didn't move. His expression was calm, the kind of calm that made noise seem irrelevant. The chairwoman continued, unbothered. "The trust also includes one condition outlined by Ms. Parker herself. Quote, the recipient must demonstrate humility in betrayal. True wealth lies not in possession, but in how one rebuilds from loss." Laura's mouth tightened. Humility. This is humiliation. Sam's lips curved into a faint smile. "No, Mrs. Hale. That was last year." The trustees exchanged quiet looks. Cameras clicked faintly outside the glass wall as members of the press gathered for the announcement. Richard reached for the pen, his silver pen, the one that had outlived everything else, and signed the final page without hesitation. His signature flowed with practiced steadiness and architect's precision. The sound of ink on paper was soft, but it felt thunderous. The deed was done. Outside, the doors opened to reporters waiting like vultures at dawn. A wave of camera flashes lit the hallway, refracting across the glass. Mr. Hale, can you comment on your inheritance? How does it feel to go from bankruptcy to billionaire status? What would you say to the family members who—" Richard raised a hand slightly, and the room fell into an expectant hush. He looked directly into the nearest camera lens, his reflection layered against the city skyline behind him. His voice was calm, grounded, unshaken. "Real men don't rebuild their egos," he said. "They rebuild their lives." A brief pause, then he added, "And real men rebuild." The phrase rippled through the room, picked up instantly by reporters typing, whispering, recording. It wasn't a sound bite. It was a declaration. Behind him, Laura's composure cracked. She turned to Sam. "You planned this." Sam's eyes met hers, cool and deliberate. "Evelyn did." Chloe looked down at her hands, shame flickering across her expression for the first time. Derek stepped back, silent, jaw tight, realization settling like concrete. Everything they'd mocked him for, he'd turned into legacy. The chairwoman closed her folder. "Congratulations, Mr. Hale. The estate is officially yours." Richard nodded once. "Thank you." He glanced briefly toward Laura, then past her, to the window, where Manhattan gleamed in the afternoon sun. The city he'd once felt too small for now seemed perfectly sized to his resolve. He turned toward Sam. "We're just getting started." Sam smiled knowingly. "I figured you'd say that." Outside the glass, cameras flashed again, lighting the room in staccato bursts. Inside, the air felt heavy with reversal. Roles rewritten, balance restored. Laura stood, frozen. Her reflection caught in the same window that mirrored Richard's. But where his gaze reached the skyline, hers stopped at her own image. The city hummed below, unaware that power had just changed hands. And somewhere beyond the press and paperwork, a quiet storm was gathering, the kind that didn't destroy but built anew. The private jet touched down just after sunset, the runway lights flickering across its polished hull like moving stars. As the engines quieted, the door opened, and Richard Hale stepped onto the tarmac. The wind carried the scent of Texas dust and jet fuel, familiar, grounding. He wore a tailored gray suit now, but his posture was the same, calm, measured, unapologetically steady. Sam Ortiz followed behind, phone in hand, coordinating with the small media team that had already gathered nearby. "They're expecting you at the venue," he said. "Local press, old friends, a few curious bankers. And Laura, of course." Richard gave a dry half-smile. "Of course." The black sedan waiting for them glided through Austin's streets, where construction cranes dotted the skyline. Billboards promoting his foundation's veteran housing project hung above the highways, proof of how much had changed since the day he drove out of the city with everything stripped away. Tonight, though, Laura Hale was throwing what she'd called a welcome home celebration. The invitation, sent through her publicist, had been draped in false sincerity, flowery words about reconciliation, forgiveness, and community. In truth, it was a stage, and she was hoping for an encore. The car pulled up outside the sprawling venue, an upscale winery just outside town. Twinkle lights hung from oak trees, guests mingled near white tables, and photographers lingered along the edges. It was the same crowd that had once turned their backs on him, the Austin elite, ready again to orbit whatever star shone brightest. As Richard stepped out, conversation hushed for a heartbeat. He looked effortlessly composed, his silver hair catching the soft glow of string lights. Sam gave a nod to the media crew that had followed from New York, discreet professionals with quiet cameras. Every move was intentional. Laura approached through the crowd, her heels clicking across the flagstone path. She was radiant, perfectly rehearsed for sympathy. Champagne dress, soft curls, a smile meant to disarm. "You look different," she said, voice smooth but uncertain. Richard met her eyes. "Perspective suits me." A polite laugh rippled through nearby guests, unsure of its place between compliment and warning. Laura's smile faltered just slightly. Sam leaned toward the cameraman. "Rolling," he whispered. Laura gestured toward the crowd. "I wanted to do something special for you, Richard. A celebration of your success. I thought maybe we could—" He raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "Actually," he said, stepping toward the microphone near the stage, "I was hoping to make an announcement myself." All eyes turned. The crowd shifted, phones lifted to record. Laura froze, her expression tight but curious. Richard's voice carried easily, warm and deliberate. "Austin built me once," he began. "Then life tested those foundations. I lost everything that didn't matter and rediscovered everything that did." He paused, letting the words hang. "I learned that rebuilding isn't about what you recover. It's about what you give forward." He looked toward the press section, then at the guests who once pitied him. "That's why I'm donating $10 million to local shelters across Texas. Homes, food, job training, real help for people who deserve better than what I went through." A collective murmur spread through the crowd, surprise, then admiration. The applause started slow, then built into genuine thunder. Flashbulbs popped, reporters shouted questions. Laura's smile had vanished entirely. She stood at the edge of the platform, her champagne glass trembling slightly. Richard turned toward her just long enough to say, softly but clearly, "Good investments pay off eventually." The audience laughed, unaware of the history behind the words, but Laura knew. Every syllable landed like a quiet strike, precise and public. Sam stepped forward, shaking Richard's hand. "Well delivered," he murmured. Richard nodded once, scanning the crowd, then the horizon. "We're not finished yet," he said under his breath. The cameras kept rolling as the applause swelled again, the lights bright and blinding. Laura turned away, her reflection caught in a wine glass, distorted, rippling. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low, soft enough only Richard seemed to hear. The paperwork arrived on a Friday morning, quietly, without ceremony. A single folder slid across Sam Ortiz's desk, stamped and sealed. Inside were deeds, contracts, and one simple confirmation. The Hale residence, formerly foreclosed, resold, and renovated under Laura's name, was now legally owned by a shell trust. The trustee's signature was neat and anonymous, just as Richard had instructed. Sam leaned back in his chair, reading it twice before looking up. "You really want to go through with this?" Richard stood by the window, the skyline of Austin reflected in the glass behind him. "It's not about revenge," he said. It's about reclamation. Sam smirked faintly. That's what the guilty say before the poetic justice hits. Richard's mouth twitched into the hint of a smile. Then, call me a poet. 2 weeks later, the plan was complete. The purchase was finalized, every legal thread perfectly woven. No one, not even the realtor, knew who the buyer really was. The mansion Laura had once flaunted on magazine covers, the same house where she once told him real men don't cry, now belonged to him again. Quietly, permanently. The next move was deliberate. A message was sent to Laura's personal email. An interested buyer would like to tour your property this afternoon. Cash offer, confidential. She replied within 20 minutes. Of course. By sunset, her black Mercedes rolled up the circular drive. The same driveway Richard had poured concrete for with his own hands 20 years ago. She stepped out dressed for performance. Pearl earrings, perfect posture, smile rehearsed. The front gate was already open. Inside, the realtor she'd worked with for years greeted her nervously. The buyer's already here, he said. Already here? She repeated, brows knitting. Without me? Yes, ma'am. He wanted a head start. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor as she entered the great room. The chandelier glittered, the air faintly perfumed with lilies, her favorite. Then she stopped cold. Richard stood by the window, hands clasped loosely behind his back, the fading daylight framing him in gold. For a second, she didn't speak. Then, breath catching. You... He turned, calm as ever. Afternoon, Laura. She blinked rapidly, trying to assemble control. What are you doing here? I wanted to see the property, he said evenly. I heard it's for sale. Color drained from her face. You're the buyer? In a manner of speaking, he said, through a trust. Easier that way. Her voice pitched higher. You can't. How did you even... He stepped closer, cutting her panic off with silence. Laura, I'm here to make this simple for both of us. The realtor hovered awkwardly at the doorway. Should I... Richard nodded toward him. Thank you, that'll be all. When the man left, the house went still again. Laura's composure cracked. I'll pay the asking price, she blurted. Whatever your offer was, I'll match it. Richard shook his head slowly. You can't. She frowned. Why not? Because I already did. The words hit like quiet thunder. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single envelope, handing it to her with the same courtesy he might offer a stranger. She took it hesitantly, tore it open, and read the line printed at the top. Notice to vacate, 30 days. Her hand trembled. You're evicting me? I'm reclaiming what was mine, he said softly. You just lived here for a while. Her lip quivered, the mask finally slipping. Richard, this is cruel. No, he replied, voice calm, eyes steady. Cruel was teaching me to measure my worth in tears. The silence that followed was deafening. She looked around the house, the chandeliers, the marble, the rooms once filled with laughter and judgment, and realized, for the first time, how hollow they sounded, without power behind them. He adjusted his cufflinks, then stepped past her toward the front door. I'll have movers sent. Consider it a courtesy. As he reached the threshold, she found her voice again, brittle and breaking. You'll regret this, Richard. He paused, turning just enough for her to see the faintest smirk. No, he said. You will. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of rain and magnolia. Richard walked down the steps slowly, the mansion glowing behind him like a relic, his past neatly boxed and sold back into silence. From the curb, he looked once more at the house, its lights flickering in the dusk. Then he got into the car beside Sam, who was waiting with the engine running. Well? Sam asked. Richard fastened his seatbelt, eyes still on the house. Closure, he said quietly. Then, after a pause, cold enough to stay permanent. The studio lights were blinding. the kind designed to make every flaw visible. Richard Hale sat in the center chair of the set, posture composed, suit crisp but understated. The air hummed with the low buzz of cameras, murmuring crew, and the faint clatter of the teleprompter. Across from him sat Lila Grant, the country's most recognizable TV anchor, known for asking the questions that made people squirm. 3, a producer called out, fingers raised. 2, 1. The red light blinked on. "Good evening," Lila began, smiling at the camera. "Tonight, we're joined by Richard Hale, the man whose story America can't stop talking about. Once bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and written off, he's now one of the most talked about builders in the nation, and heir to the late Evelyn Parker's billion-dollar trust." Applause rippled through the audience. Richard nodded politely. Lila turned to him, smile softening. "Mr. Hale, a few years ago, your life fell apart on camera. Your wife left you in public, your children mocked you, and your name all but disappeared. And now, here you are, richer than ever, admired, almost mythologized. Tell us, any message for the people watching who saw both versions of you?" Richard let the question hang for a moment, his fingers folded loosely in his lap. "Money doesn't change truth," he said finally. "It just amplifies it." Lila tilted her head. "Amplifies?" He met her gaze. "When you're poor, people call silence weakness. When you're wealthy, they call it composure. Same man, same silence, just louder surroundings." The audience went quiet, the weight of his words cutting through the hum of lights. Lila's producers cued the next clip. Behind them, on the large LED wall, footage began to play. Laura's old live stream from that steakhouse dinner. Her words echoed, still cruel after all this time. "Real men don't cry, Dad. Be a man." The camera cut back to Richard, sitting exactly as he had back then, still unbroken, steady. The juxtaposition was surgical, humiliation beside restraint, mockery beside grace. The crowd stirred. You could feel the shift, sympathy mixed with admiration. Lila leaned forward slightly. "When you hear that now, what do you feel?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. "Gratitude," he said quietly. "Without that moment, I'd still be building houses. Now, I build legacies." The audience broke into applause. It wasn't polite. It was thunderous, rising, the sound of redemption realized in real time. Even Lila seemed caught off guard. "That's remarkable perspective," she said. He smiled faintly. "Perspective suits me." The interview continued, questions about the trust, the veterans' homes, his philanthropic donations. But Richard never strayed into arrogance. Every answer was grounded, controlled, humble, but sharp. When asked about wealth, he replied, "It's not what you keep, it's what you build from it." When asked about forgiveness, he said, "Some people need to live with what they did before they can ask for it." By the end, even the seasoned anchor looked moved. "Final question," Lila said, turning to camera. "You've inspired millions of viewers. What's next for you, Richard Hale?" He smiled slightly. "More foundations, fewer walls." The audience erupted again, some standing, clapping. The red light above the camera blinked off, signaling the end of the segment. Crew members moved quickly to reset, but Lila stayed seated, studying him. "You know," she said softly, "most people come here to sell something. An image, a brand. You just sat here and dismantled the need for both." Richard shrugged. "When you've lost everything that isn't real, you stop pretending." Minutes later, in the dressing room, Sam handed him an envelope. "Your interview fee. Big network, generous rate." Richard didn't even open it. "Donate it," he said. "Local shelters." Sam smiled. "You're consistent. I'll give you that." By the time the interview aired that night, the internet had already found its favorite quote. Screens across the country filled with headlines, "The man who didn't cry, he calculated." Clips of the steakhouse scene replayed beside his composed interview. the transformation too cinematic to believe. Viewers flooded the comments. This is what redemption looks like. He didn't get revenge, he evolved. The algorithm took over, and Richard's face, once the symbol of loss, became a mirror of resilience. In his quiet hotel room later, Richard watched the replay just once. When the screen cut to black, he turned it off. "Amplify truth," he murmured, "nothing more." Outside, Manhattan glowed. Somewhere beneath that city of noise, a new story was already building. The meeting wasn't scheduled, but Richard knew they'd come eventually. The office in Manhattan was quiet that morning. Only the hum of the city outside, the rustle of paper, and the soft tick of a clock on the wall. When the receptionist buzzed him, her tone carried a trace of hesitation. "Mr. Hale, your children are here." He set his pen down slowly. "Send them in." Derek walked in first, confident stride, though his tailored jacket couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. Chloe followed, clutching her phone like a shield. They looked older than the last time he'd seen them. Or maybe just smaller. "Dad," Derek started, forcing a smile, "you look good." Richard gestured toward the chairs opposite his desk. "You can sit." They did, exchanging quick glances. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of things unsaid. Finally, Derek cleared his throat. "I won't waste your time. I've got a business plan, real estate development, mid-tier homes, sustainable design. I just need initial funding, a loan, not charity." Richard listened, eyes steady. He didn't interrupt. Chloe jumped in before he could respond. "And I've been working on rebuilding my brand. I'm using my platform for good now, charity features, awareness campaigns. But PR's expensive, and I figured—" Her voice trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Richard folded his hands, studying them both. "So," he said finally, "you're here because you want money." Derek flinched slightly. "We're here because we want a chance," Chloe nodded quickly. "To do better." He leaned back, letting the silence stretch just long enough to test them. "You've both had chances," he said softly. "But maybe it's time you earned one." Chloe frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I'll make you an offer. Each of you will build one house, for someone who needs it. No contractors, no assistants, no cameras. Just you, a team of volunteers, and sweat equity." Derek blinked. "You mean physically build a house?" "Yes," Richard said. "From the ground up. Foundations, framing, paint. The works." Chloe scoffed lightly. "Dad, I'm not a—" He turned, voice firm. "You asked for help. I'm giving you the same deal life gave me. Work first, reward after. Do it with sincerity, and I'll fund your ventures, both of them." They exchanged looks, disbelief written across their faces. "You can't be serious," Derek said. "I've never been more serious." Chloe crossed her arms. "And if we don't?" Richard's gaze hardened slightly. "Then you've learned nothing." The quiet that followed was different now, less defensive, more uncertain. Derek ran a hand through his hair, weighing pride against need. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, I'll do it." Chloe hesitated, then nodded. "Me too." Richard gave a small nod. "Good. Sam will coordinate logistics. The rest is up to you." Weeks passed, and the cameras that once followed Chloe's glamorous life now caught glimpses of something else. Mud on her hands, sweat on her brow, her laughter mixing with volunteers as she helped raise a frame beneath the Texas sun. Derek, meanwhile, learned the rhythm of labor, the sting of blisters, the discipline of teamwork, the quiet satisfaction of watching a home take shape where there was once nothing. Each evening, Richard checked the progress reports from afar, saying little. He didn't need to watch them work to know change was happening. Some lessons only set when built by hand. On the final day, when both homes stood complete, the families who'd received them arrived. Tears, hugs, Gratitude. Chloe stood apart, eyes glassy, while Derek helped carry in furniture. For once, no one reached for a phone to capture it. Later, they returned to his office, dusty and tired, but different, calmer, humbled. Richard looked at them, expression unreadable. "So," he said, "did it feel like work?" Derek smiled faintly. "It felt real." Chloe nodded. "It felt right." He simply said, "Good. Now we build something else." Outside, the city lights shimmered against the windows, reflections of three faces, no longer strangers, only rebuilding. The storm came not from the sky, but from headlines. One morning, while Richard was reviewing construction reports, his phone began buzzing nonstop, calls, messages, notifications lighting up like wildfire. Sam Ortiz walked into his office already holding a printed copy of the story. "Don't bother checking online," Sam said, tossing the paper onto the desk. She went national this time. Across the front page was Laura Hale's face, flawless as ever, framed by the headline, "The woman behind the builder, how Laura Hale guided her ex-husband's empire." Richard read the first few lines silently. Words like visionary partner and emotional architect jumped out, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. She claimed she had helped design the early concepts for his housing projects, that her guidance and support had shaped the man he became. It was the same trick she'd used before: take what she broke, then claim credit for the pieces. Sam leaned against the desk, arms folded. She sold exclusives to 3 outlets, gave interviews, called you her greatest creative collaboration. Richard's eyes stayed on the page, unreadable. "And people believe it?" "For now," Sam said, "but I've already sent the trustees every legal record, timestamp, design draft, and email we have. By tomorrow, she'll look like she wrote fiction." Richard's expression softened slightly. "She's chasing echoes again," Sam smirked. "Then let's make sure her voice fades fast." Within 24 hours, Sam's counterstrike hit the media like precision artillery. The same outlets that praised Laura turned on her when the documentation surfaced. Proof of Richard's work, logged years before their marriage, design filing signed solely in his name, trust records predating her involvement entirely. Comment sections flipped from admiration to mockery. "She's reaching. Classic opportunist move. Real men don't cry, and real women shouldn't lie." By the weekend, Laura had vanished from interviews. Sponsors cut ties. Even her social accounts went dark. When Sam dropped by Richard's office Monday morning, he found him exactly where he always was, leaning over new sketches, sleeves rolled up, pencil moving with quiet purpose. "You're not even celebrating," Sam said, half laughing. "You realize the internet just dragged her into oblivion, right?" Richard didn't look up. "Let her chase noise," he said evenly. "We'll build silence." Sam frowned thoughtfully. "You're not angry?" Richard paused, pencil tip resting against the page. "Anger builds walls. I'm done with walls." Outside, the construction site was alive. Machines, workers, cranes moving in perfect rhythm. Richard stepped to the window, watching them pour concrete under the morning sun. Rows upon rows of foundations stretched toward the horizon. The Hale Housing Initiative had grown beyond a project now. It was a movement. Overhead, a drone camera buzzed quietly, capturing footage for the foundation's next public report. From above, the view was breathtaking. Hundreds of homes rising in unison, each one bearing the same engraved emblem on its cornerstone, built with dignity. That image, the slow, methodical birth of an entire community, spread across the nation's screens. News anchors called it justice through creation. Veterans who once lived in cars were now holding keys. Families who'd lost hope were standing under new roofs. When reporters tried to ask Richard for comment on Laura's downfall, he only gave a small, polite smile. "We don't respond to demolition," he said. "We build." Sam, standing beside him, gave a low chuckle. "You realize you've become a quote machine, right?" Richard picked up his hard hat, sliding it under his arm. Then let's make sure every word leaves something standing. As the drone camera panned higher, the full scale of the project came into view. Hundreds of rooftops glowing in the sunset, the sound of hammers and laughter echoing like a heartbeat. In that wide aerial shot, the man once mocked for crying had become the architect of redemption. And this time, no one could rewrite his blueprint. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fresh lumber, asphalt, and wildflowers from the field beyond. Hundreds had gathered under the wide Texas sky, their voices soft murmurs against the sound of flags rustling in the wind. A temporary stage stood before rows of newly built homes, gleaming white siding, American flags on porches, sunlight glinting off metal roofs. At the center of it all stood the bronze plaque, draped in cloth. It was larger than expected, fixed to a stone pedestal near the first completed home. Reporters waited with cameras poised, veterans stood at attention, and families pressed close, holding small American flags in their hands. Richard Hale stood just behind the stage, his hard hat tucked beneath one arm. Sam Ortiz adjusted the microphone at the podium, then gave him a subtle nod. "They're ready for you," he said quietly. Richard looked out over the crowd, faces of men and women who'd built beside him, cried beside him, rebuilt their dignity along with their homes. He took a steady breath and stepped forward. Applause rose as he climbed the steps. It wasn't the wild, empty kind meant for celebrity. It was warm, grateful, real, the kind that carried weight. Sam took his place off to the side, smiling as Richard reached for the cord hanging from the plaque. "Today," Richard began, voice deep and steady, "we dedicate more than just homes. We dedicate proof." He pulled the cord. The cloth fell away, revealing the words engraved into bronze. "Hale Homes, built with tears and steel." The crowd fell silent, the weight of those 5 words settling over them. The phrase wasn't poetic. It was honest, raw, and hard-earned. In the front row, Chloe covered her mouth, her eyes brimming. She'd seen her father's name on blueprints, in headlines, but never like this, etched into permanence, tied to something larger than pain. Derek, standing beside her, straightened his shoulders and raised his hand in a small salute toward the veteran sitting nearby. They nodded in return, a silent exchange between men who understood endurance. Near the gate, security guards stood firm as a woman in designer sunglasses tried to push past the rope. Laura's voice carried over the hum of the crowd. "I'm his family," she snapped. The guard was polite, but unyielding. "Invitation only, ma'am." Her voice faltered. For the first time, the cameras didn't turn toward her. They turned away. She took a slow step back, realization dawning in the stillness. On stage, Richard continued, oblivious or simply unmoved. "I used to think strength meant silence, that if you didn't cry, you were holding it together. But life, it taught me something different." He paused, looking out across the sea of faces, workers, soldiers, children playing near the edges of the crowd. "Crying never made me weak," he said. "Stopping did." The words landed like a wave. The veterans rose first, clapping slowly, then the workers joined, then the families. Within seconds, the applause swelled into something electric. Cheers, whistles, even tears from those who'd once been too proud to show them. The band on stage struck the opening notes of a brass anthem, low and resonant. Camera drones lifted into the sky, capturing sweeping shots of the rows of homes behind him, the plaque gleaming in sunlight, and the crowd standing as one. Richard glanced toward Sam, who stood just off stage, arms crossed and eyes glistening despite his grin. When their eyes met, Sam mouthed 2 words, "Ledger balanced." Richard nodded once, almost imperceptibly. As the music swelled, he looked up at the horizon where new lots were already being cleared, where more homes would rise. There was no arrogance in his expression, no triumph, just quiet fulfillment, the peace that comes when a man's purpose aligns perfectly with his pain. In the crowd, Chloe wiped her eyes and leaned toward Derek. "He really did it," she whispered. Derek didn't look away from their father. "No," he said softly. "He's still doing it." The camera panned wide, the veterans saluting, the families cheering, the plaque gleaming under the Texas sun. And at the center of it all, Richard Hale stood tall, not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who rebuilt everything that mattered. The press conference took place inside a renovated community center in downtown Austin, once abandoned, now gleaming with new purpose. The walls, freshly painted in muted blue and silver, bore a single banner stretched across the stage. "The Real Men Do." Cry Foundation, supporting widowers, veterans, and families of Silent Strength cameras, lined the back of the room, flashes already popping before the event even began. The air hummed with anticipation. Outside, a modest crowd had gathered. Families, veterans, local officials, and journalists, eager to hear the man who had turned grief into blueprint and blueprint into empire. When Richard Hale stepped up to the podium, the murmurs softened into silence. He wore a simple gray suit, no jewelry, no pin, no spectacle, just the quiet gravity of someone who'd lived every word he was about to say. He placed his silver pen on the podium beside his notes. "When I lost everything," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I thought the silence would swallow me. The house, the family, the business, they were gone. But what hurt most wasn't the loss. It was the shame that came with it." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the audience. "They said real men don't cry. And for years, I believed them. Until one day I realized real men do cry. They just don't stop building afterward." The applause started slowly, then grew, a sound that seemed to fill the room like sunlight. He continued, "The Real Men Do Cry Foundation is for the men who've lost and kept going, for widowers navigating life alone, for veterans rebuilding after war, for anyone who's ever mistaken tears for weakness. This foundation will offer counseling, job programs, scholarships, and housing, because rebuilding starts within." His tone wasn't rehearsed. It was lived. Every word came from somewhere deep, every pause earned through pain. When the speech ended, the room erupted into applause. Journalists shouted questions, cameras whirred, and within hours, headlines were already live across national outlets. Richard Hale, the architect of empathy, the man who built strength out of tears. Even the most cynical commentators couldn't resist the symbolism. A man once mocked for emotion, now teaching the world that emotion itself was a foundation. Behind the noise, behind the bright stage lights, Laura Hale watched the live stream from her quiet living room. The glow of the television reflected across her face, her eyes swollen, voice trembling, as she recorded a short video on her phone. "I just want to say, I'm sorry," she began, "for everything I said, for not understanding what strength really looked like. Richard, you deserved better." She posted it online with the caption, "Apology, late but sincere." The clip made its rounds, gaining millions of views, but when reporters asked Richard for comment, he simply said, "Some apologies are meant for silence." And he left it at that. Instead of feeding the story, he redirected the attention. The foundation launched a scholarship in the name of his first wife, Olivia Hale, the woman who'd believed in his integrity when no one else did. The Olivia Hale Memorial Scholarship became the cornerstone of the foundation's mission, helping women pursuing architecture, social work, and therapy, carrying Olivia's legacy of compassion into new generations. During the first award ceremony, a young student, one of the recipients, stood on stage and said through tears, "I didn't know, Olivia, but I feel like I do through the homes you built. Thank you, Mr. Hale, for proving that strength isn't about not crying, it's about not quitting." Richard smiled quietly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his mouth but filled his eyes. Chloe and Derek, now both active volunteers with the foundation, stood nearby helping coordinate the event. Derek had taken charge of logistics and outreach programs for veterans, while Chloe handled media and branding. This time, not for herself, but for something real. During lunch, she approached him as he watched a group of widowers share stories over coffee. "You did it, Dad," she said softly. "You turned pain into all of this." He glanced around the room, laughter, conversation, connection, and shook his head. "No," he said gently. "We did." Later, when the last guest had left and the stage lights dimmed, Richard remained behind, running his fingers across the bronze plaque that bore the foundation's name. Beneath it, a single line of engraving read, "Dedicated to those who rebuild with tears in their eyes and strength in their hands." He traced the words with quiet reverence. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. No rage, no revenge, no noise. Just the hum of life continuing, shaped by hands that refused to stop working. Sam entered from the back, smiling as he handed Richard a folder. "You know, for a man who hates attention, you sure know how to cause headlines." Richard chuckled. "If they're listening, they might as well hear something that matters." Sam nodded. "And now?" Richard looked toward the door, where the last rays of evening light spilled into the room. "Now we build again," he said quietly. Outside, the foundation's sign caught the setting sun, glowing like a promise. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Richard Hale's study, dust motes dancing in the golden light. The room smelled faintly of cedar and paper, a lifetime of blueprints, journals, and quiet reflection. Across the desk sat Noah, Derek's son, 12 years old, hair sticking up from a rushed morning, his backpack half zipped. He had his father's sharp features, but Richard's calm eyes. In front of him sat a small school recorder and a notebook filled with questions written in careful, messy handwriting. "Okay, Grandpa," Noah said, pushing the red button on the recorder. "My teacher says we have to interview someone who's inspired us." Richard smiled faintly. "And you picked me?" "Yeah," Noah said without hesitation. "Dad said you've got the best story, but I don't want the boring version, like the internet one. I want the real one." Richard leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking. "Fair enough." Noah adjusted his recorder like a miniature journalist. "Question 1, he read. "What's strength?" Richard looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Strength," he said slowly, "is standing back up, with receipts." Noah blinked, pen hovering above his paper. "Receipts?" Richard chuckled. "Proof. Evidence. You get knocked down, people laugh, doubt you, say you're done. Strength isn't just rising. It's rising with proof that you didn't break, that you learned." The boy grinned, scribbling furiously. "Standing back up? With receipts? That's awesome." He looked up, bright-eyed. "I'm going to quote you." "Make sure you spell it right," Richard teased. They both laughed, and the sound filled the room with something light, something new. Noah flipped to his next question. "What made you start building again? After, you know?" Richard took a slow breath. "Because if I stopped building, I'd still be standing in the ruins." The boy nodded, pretending to understand, but sensing the gravity beneath the words. "So, you built houses for other people to get out of their ruins too?" Richard smiled. "Something like that." The conversation drifted between serious and playful, the kind that only happens between a grandfather and grandson. Richard told stories about his first construction job, how a wrong measurement once cost him an entire porch. Noah laughed so hard he nearly dropped his pen, but as the laughter faded, Noah grew quieter. "Dad told me Grandma Laura said mean things to you before. Is that true?" Richard didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "It was a long time ago. People act out of fear, not always cruelty. Some lessons cost more than others." Noah looked thoughtful. Did you forgive her? I don't have to, Richard said gently. I just had to stop carrying her mistakes in my pockets. The boy stared at him for a long moment, then smiled. You sound like one of those old movie heroes. Richard chuckled. Just an old builder who finally read the blueprints right. The recorder's light blinked red, indicating low battery. Noah noticed, but didn't stop recording. Last question, he said, flipping the page. What's one thing you want people to remember about you when you're gone? Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a familiar object, a silver pen, worn smooth from years of use. He placed it on the table between them. That, he said softly. Noah looked puzzled. A pen? It belonged to my father, Richard said, and now it's yours. The boy's eyes widened. Really? Richard nodded. It's seen more history than I ever wrote down, but it's not for numbers or signatures. It's for truth. Write truth before numbers, Noah. Always. Noah took it carefully, as if holding something sacred. I will, he whispered. The recorder clicked off. Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't empty. It was rich with connection, the quiet transfer of wisdom from one generation to the next. As Noah packed his bag, he looked back once more. Hey, Grandpa? Yes? You really are strong. Richard smiled, eyes soft. No, son. I just learned how to rebuild. When the door closed behind the boy, Richard sat back in his chair, the late sun spilling across his desk. The silver pen's twin, a matching pencil holder Olivia had given him decades ago, caught the light. He whispered, almost to her memory, the foundation's holding. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The courthouse smelled of old wood and air conditioning, sterile, timeless, indifferent to human drama. Richard Hale sat quietly at the defense table, his posture calm, his suit perfectly pressed. Across the aisle sat Laura, her expression a blend of defiance and desperation. Her lawyer leaned in every few minutes, whispering arguments that sounded rehearsed and hollow. The case title on the docket read, Laura Hale versus Richard Hale, Emotional Damages. She was suing him for psychological distress, brought on by his public success and defamatory silence. The irony was so thick, the court clerk had to read the statement twice to keep a straight face. Reporters lined the benches in the back, pens ready, lenses trained on the woman who'd once laughed at her husband's tears. Now, she sat under the same lights she'd once used for attention, only this time they exposed everything. When the judge entered, the room rose. The gavel struck once. Proceed, he said. Laura's attorney began with dramatics. Your Honor, my client endured years of emotional hardship due to Mr. Hale's vindictive behavior following their divorce. His public image, crafted as a saintly philanthropist, has cast her as a villain, unfairly damaging her mental health, reputation, and social standing. A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge raised a hand. Keep it to evidence, counselor. The lawyer nodded and gestured to a projector. The first exhibit appeared on the screen, a compilation of news clips and social media posts featuring Richard's philanthropic work. Then, strategically woven in, were Laura's interviews, where she'd once claimed credit for his empire and mocked his rebuilding. The lawyer spoke dramatically. These repeated public displays humiliated my client. The judge interrupted, leaning forward. Humiliated your client by showing the world her own statements? A brief silence. The lawyer stammered, Well, context? The judge gestured towards Sam Ortiz, seated quietly behind Richard. Mr. Ortiz, your counsel for the defense? Sam stood. Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to submit Exhibit B, unedited footage of the plaintiff's statements, social posts, and interviews, including the now infamous Real Men Don't Cry clip. The bailiff handed over a flash drive. The judge nodded to the technician. Play it. The courtroom lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life, replaying that steakhouse scene, the one that started everything. Laura's voice rang through the speakers crystal clear. Real men don't cry, Dad. Be a man. A low murmur filled the room. Chloe, seated in the back, lowered her head. Derek looked away, jaw tight. The video rolled on. Clips of Laura's interviews, captions she'd posted flaunting her freedom, the self-congratulatory talk show appearances. Then, footage of Richard, never retaliating, never mocking, just working, building, creating. When the lights came back up, the silence was absolute. The judge sighed, folding his hands. Mrs. Hale, I've presided over thousands of cases, but I'll admit, this one's unique. You claim emotional damages caused by your ex-husband's success, yet every exhibit shows you mocking him when he fell, and him saying nothing when he rose. Laura's face reddened. That's not, he humiliated me by doing better. A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. The judge allowed himself the faintest smile. Seems to me, the defendant only cried once, in dignity. Laughter broke out across the courtroom. Restrained but audible. Even the stenographer paused to steady her hands. Laura shot up from her chair. This is absurd. The judge banged his gavel lightly. Motion to dismiss granted. Case closed. The echo of wood striking wood was final. Reporters scrambled toward the hallway, the clicking of cameras chasing her as Laura stormed out, muttering under her breath. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, shouting questions she didn't answer. Inside, Richard stayed seated. Sam gathered the papers into a neat stack, glancing at him. You could have fought harder, you know. You didn't say a word. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. I didn't need to. He stood, smoothing his jacket. Sometimes silence finishes what words can't. As they walked toward the exit, the last bits of laughter still echoed faintly down the corridor. Outside, the reporters turned their cameras from Laura's chaos toward the calm man walking into the sunlight. Richard didn't stop for interviews. He just buttoned his jacket, looked up at the sky, and smiled faintly. Poetic justice, perfectly constructed. No hammer, no courtroom argument, just truth standing where falsehood fell. Sam looked over. Ledger balanced? Richard nodded once. Interest accrued. The sun dipped low over the veteran housing site, bathing the new homes in a soft amber glow. Smoke rose from the barbecue grills, curling lazily into the evening air. Children ran between picnic tables, veterans laughed over paper plates, and the smell of grilled corn and hickory filled the open space. For once, it wasn't a gala or fundraiser. No cameras, no microphones, just a simple community dinner organized by Derek and Chloe Hale. Hand-painted signs read, "Thank you, Dad." Richard arrived late, his truck crunching over the gravel road he'd once helped pave himself. He stepped out slowly, taking in the sight. His children, once divided by greed and pride, now wearing aprons, serving food, laughing with the very people they'd once looked down on. Derek spotted him first. "Dad," he called, waving him over. Chloe turned, her smile genuine and unguarded. "We saved you a seat." Richard walked toward them, hands in his pockets, the sound of conversation fading, just enough for the moment to feel suspended in time. He looked around at the crowd, veterans sitting shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, families whose lives had been rebuilt from the ground up. It wasn't luxury, but it was real. Derek clinked his glass lightly, getting everyone's attention. "Hey, everyone," he said. I just wanted to say a few words." The group quieted, expectant. Derek's voice wavered slightly. "When we started this project, we didn't really understand what Dad was trying to do. We thought it was just about houses, but it wasn't." He glanced at Richard, eyes steady but wet. "It was about dignity, about building something that lasts longer than pride." Chloe stepped up beside him, her hand resting gently on Derek's arm. "We've made a lot of mistakes," she said softly. "But our father, he showed us what real strength looks like. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He just built, and somehow that taught us everything we needed to learn. The crowd applauded, slow, respectful, emotional. Some of the veterans wiped at their eyes. Richard stood still, the sound washing over him. Then slowly, he reached for the glass of iced tea in front of him and raised it slightly. "To crying when it counts," he said, voice calm but full. The crowd went silent, then erupted into applause. It wasn't loud, it was powerful, grounded, sincere. The veterans rose first, then the volunteers, and soon the entire gathering stood in a shared moment of unity. Even Sam Ortiz, standing at the back with a plate of brisket, gave a slow nod. "That's one hell of a toast," he muttered to himself. The band began to play softly, acoustic guitars, a fiddle weaving through gentle notes. The sound mingled with laughter and the clinking of dishes. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Richard caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the crowd, just beyond the fence line. Laura. She wore no makeup, no performance mask, just a simple dress, her hair pulled back. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes, they were different now. They weren't hard or proud. They were tired, remorseful, human. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, years of betrayal, humiliation, and grief compressed into one quiet exchange. Then Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not forgiveness exactly, but closure. Laura nodded back, her expression breaking into something that looked like gratitude. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fading light. Chloe came up beside him, following his gaze. "Was that—" "Yes," Richard said simply. "It was." They stood together for a moment, the night air cooling around them. Laughter drifted from the tables, and somewhere, a veteran began to sing softly, his voice deep and warm. Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that releases years. The music swelled gently, no triumph, no tragedy, just peace. He looked at his family, his friends, and the homes rising in the distance. For the first time, everything felt exactly as it should. And as the final notes of the song faded, Richard smiled. A man rebuilt, surrounded by what he'd constructed with both hands and heart. The glass atrium of the new Hale Foundation headquarters was alive with the hum of cameras, flashes, and soft chatter. Banners hung from the rafters. Hale Homes Global Initiative, building dignity across borders. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and morning coffee. Outside, the sunrise poured golden light across the skyline, casting long reflections across the marble floor. At the center of it all sat a long oak table covered in white linen, where the final documents awaited signature. Richard Hale stood beside it, flanked by Sam Ortiz, several international partners, and a semicircle of reporters eager for their moment. The charter would formalize the expansion of his foundation's work, affordable housing for veterans, widowers, and displaced families in 10 new countries. What began with one man's humiliation had become a movement that could outlive him. Sam leaned in, speaking low enough for only Richard to hear. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Watching the world show up to witness a man they once forgot." Richard gave a small, steady smile. "They didn't forget, Sam. They just waited for proof." The room quieted as the host approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, today marks a global partnership rooted not in profit, but in empathy. A blueprint for dignity." A round of applause followed. Cameras clicked like rainfall. Richard stepped forward. He adjusted his cufflinks, an old habit by now, and took his seat at the table. The pen beside the charter wasn't just any pen. It was the silver one, the same that had survived the pawn shops, the failures, the rebuild. It glinted softly under the light. A reporter called out, "Mr. Hale, before you sign, can you tell us, what does this moment mean to you?" Richard looked up, eyes thoughtful. "It means the foundation held," he said, Not the buildings, the people. The audience quieted again. He picked up the pen and placed the first deliberate signature across the parchment. The scratching of metal against paper was the only sound in the room. He signed once more, completing it, and exhaled slowly. Applause thundered. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised. One voice broke through the noise. "Mr. Hale, why build this organization around emotion? Why cry?" The question hung in the air, half sincere, half skeptical. Richard turned toward the cameras, posture steady, expression clear. His answer came without hesitation. "Because tears," he said, "are proof the tank isn't empty." The room went still. Even the camera flashes seemed to pause, as if giving the moment room to breathe. Then the clicks resumed, faster now, capturing the quote, the expression, the truth. Sam watched from the side, smiling faintly. He whispered to one of the journalists, "You'll want to write that down." The reporters did more than write it. They immortalized it. Within minutes, social feeds began filling with the phrase, stamped beneath photos of Richard standing against the rising light, "Tears are proof the tank isn't empty." He didn't bask in it. Fame had long stopped being a comfort. Instead, he leaned towards Sam, who was holding a large, rolled-up tube. Sam tapped it once. "You forgot something." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" Sam handed it over. "New blueprint. You'll want to see it." Richard unrolled it across the table. The paper spread like a map, lines, grids, and notations stretching far beyond Texas or New York. At the center, bold letters read, "Hale Homes, Phase 5, Hope." He studied it for a moment, eyes softening as he took in the details. Modular communities, emergency housing units, global outreach hubs. The kind of project Olivia would have believed in. He looked up at Sam, emotion flickering beneath control. "Next phase," he said quietly. "Hope." Sam's grin widened. "The best kind of foundation." Outside, the sun had risen fully now, spilling gold across the windows. The reporters continued snapping photos, immortalizing a man who had turned ruin into architecture, grief into blueprint. As Richard stood at the podium for one final photo, the cameras captured him mid-smile, the kind of smile that held decades of pain, wisdom, and peace. The light flared against the glass, framing him in brilliance as the camera flash froze the moment forever. The Manhattan loft overlooked the river, its tall windows catching the glow of city lights rippling across the water. The dinner was small, quiet. No cameras, no press, just a handful of people who'd weathered decades together. The long wooden table set with simple candles and crystal glasses carried the warm scent of rosemary and roasted lamb. Sam Ortiz had always said he'd retire before his hair turned completely gray. He was about 10 years late on that promise. His laugh still filled a room, his wit as sharp as ever. But his steps had slowed, and the briefcase he once carried everywhere now sat unopened by his chair. Richard Hale stood at the window, looking out at the city that had both crushed and rebuilt him. "You sure you want to stop?" he asked quietly, turning towards Sam. "You don't exactly fit the picture of a man ready for peace." Sam grinned, cutting into his food. "Peace doesn't need to fit a picture. It just needs the right view." He gestured to the window. "And this one will do." The others at the table chuckled politely, then drifted into smaller conversations, leaving the two men to their own. Decades of shared victories and scars had carved a bond between them that didn't need words. After dessert, Sam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, aged envelope, the paper yellowed at the corners. He slid it across the table. "This belongs to you." Richard picked it up, reading the handwritten label across the front, Phase 4, Peace. He looked up, confused. "I thought we were already in Phase 5. Sam chuckled softly. "Phase 5's for the world, Rich. This one's for you." Richard carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, faded, worn at the edges. It was the first blueprint he'd ever drawn for the Hale Homes project, back when he was still living in that one-room apartment overlooking the train tracks. He remembered that night clearly. The trembling hands, the silver pen, the words scribbled across the margin. Dignity accrues interest. He turned the photo over. On the back, Sam had written a note in his steady looping handwriting. Balance achieved. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the city below filled the quiet, the distant horns, the hum of life carrying on. Richard ran his thumb along the photograph's edge, eyes soft with memory. "You kept this all these years?" he asked. Sam smiled. "Someone had to keep score." Richard gave a low laugh. "You were never much of a scorekeeper." Sam shrugged. "Maybe not, but I knew when the ledger was balanced." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "And tonight, my friend, it is." Richard met his glass halfway. To balance. They drank quietly. No speeches, no dramatics, just two men acknowledging the rare peace that comes after a long war well fought. When the laughter around the room began to fade and the night drew closer to its end, Sam stood and reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a smaller envelope, this one crisp and white, and placed it in front of Richard. "What's this?" "Your next trip," Sam said simply. Richard opened it. Inside was a plane ticket, one way, printed in understated black letters. Destination, Lake Tahoe. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "Tahoe?" Sam nodded. "You bought that cabin years ago and never set foot in it. Evelyn left it in your trust, remember? She said it was for reflection, not escape." Richard turned the ticket in his hands, the corners catching the candlelight. "And you think I'm ready for reflection?" Sam smiled gently. "You've spent years building homes for everyone else. Time to build one for your soul." They stood, and for the first time in years, they hugged. Not as business partners, not as lawyer and client, but as brothers who'd walked through fire and found their way out together. When they stepped back, Sam's voice was soft. "Don't overthink this one, Rich. Just go. The world's safe in good hands now." Richard looked at the photograph again, the words balance achieved, glowing faintly in the low light. He slipped both envelopes into his jacket pocket and nodded. Outside, the river shimmered like liquid gold beneath the moonlight. Somewhere in that quiet reflection, a new phase was already waiting. The road to Lake Tahoe wound through forests blanketed in white. Pines bowed under the weight of snow, and the world outside Richard's windshield seemed untouched by noise or time. The air thinned with altitude, pure and cold, the kind that made every breath feel earned. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, it looked exactly as the photographs had promised, small, weathered, but sturdy. He had bought it years ago and never once set foot here. Now, with the truck idling in the drive and silence pressing in, it felt like the place had been waiting for him. He stepped out, boots crunching on the snow. The lake stretched before him, still, glassy, infinite. His reflection stared back, older, lined, but calm. He stood there for a long moment, letting the cold sting his face. For the first time in decades, there were no deadlines, no calls, no boardrooms. Just snow, silence, and peace. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and dust. He opened the windows to let in the mountain air, then set a fire in the stone hearth. The flames took slowly, crackling to life, painting the wooden walls in amber light. He unpacked one small duffel, a notebook, his silver pen, a folded photograph of his late wife Olivia, and the envelope Sam had given him with the plane ticket. No computer, no phone, just paper and time. He sat at the table by the window, where the snow reflected the morning sun, and opened the notebook. For years, every design he'd drawn was for someone else. Homes, foundations, buildings that meant renewal for others. But this page was blank, waiting for something different. He placed the tip of the pen to the paper and began sketching. At first, the lines were simple, parallel beams, structural outlines. Then his hand slowed, and he drew something more symbolic. A bridge, arched, graceful, spanning across the lake. One side anchored in the forest, the other fading into light. He paused, studying it. The bridge wasn't for traffic or construction. It was metaphor, a passage between what had been broken and what had been healed, between regret and release. Forgiveness rendered in blueprint form. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet flakes drifting against the window. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the old photo Sam had given him, the first Hale Holmes sketch. He placed it beside the new drawing, two lives separated by decades but joined by the same steady hand. In that moment, the narration would fade in, his voice, calm and reflective, layered over the sound of wind and fire. I built homes for others, now one for my heart. He said it softly, almost a whisper, as though the cabin itself needed to hear it. The fire crackled louder, the flames dancing higher. He leaned back, eyes on the sketch, and something inside him finally loosened. The walls he had built, not with wood or steel but with silence, began to give way. A tear slipped down his cheek, slow and unforced. Not from grief, not from loss, but from release. It was his first free tear in years. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall onto the paper, where it left a small, imperfect mark beside the bridge's outline, a human touch that no ruler or pen could reproduce. The cabin settled around him, creaking softly as the fire warmed the air. Outside, the lake shimmered faintly beneath the pale sky. Richard sat there for hours, watching the flames and the snow take turns dancing across the glass. The soundtrack of the moment was simple: a crackling fire, a whispering wind, a quiet heartbeat. The camera would pull back now, slowly, from the window, framing him as a solitary figure, surrounded by warmth and white silence. He picked up the pen again, adding one final note at the bottom of the page. Piece, Phase 4. Complete. As the fire popped and the screen faded to black, the score would swell, strings and piano blending in perfect stillness. Pure catharsis. No revenge, no anger, just the sound of a man finally at peace with the echoes he'd built. The morning light over Lake Tahoe was thin and pale, stretching across the snow like spilled silk. Inside the cabin, the fire from the previous night had dwindled to glowing embers. Richard sat at the table again, same pen, same notebook, but this time his movements were slower, more deliberate. In front of him lay a single envelope, cream-colored, handwritten address, no return label. He'd written and rewritten it 3 times, searching for the right words, only to realize he didn't need many. He reached for the silver pen one last time and wrote a single line on the thick sheet of paper inside. Then he folded it neatly, slid it into the envelope, and sealed it. No check, no photograph, no closure speech. Just a sentence. On the front, in his careful, unhurried handwriting, to Laura. He sat there for a long while before placing the letter in the outgoing mail pile on the counter. When the postal carrier arrived that afternoon, Richard simply nodded, handed it over, and watched as the small envelope disappeared into the van's bin. He didn't expect a response. That wasn't the point. Miles away, in Austin, Texas, Laura Hale lived quietly now. The house she once flaunted was gone, replaced by a modest apartment with more silence than she liked to admit. Her days were predictable: coffee, errands, the occasional online apology interview that nobody really watched anymore. When the letter arrived, she almost didn't open it. The handwriting stopped her, steady, patient, familiar. She turned the envelope over once, twice, feeling its lightness. It weighed almost nothing. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper. There was no salutation, no apology, no anger. Just one sentence in black ink. Real men don't cry, they rebuild. The words hit harder than she expected. They weren't cruel. They weren't triumphant. They were simply true. Laura stared at the page until her vision blurred. The tears came slowly at first, one or two slipping down, then more. They weren't tears of guilt or self-pity, just something quieter, something that felt like acceptance. Her reflection in the window caught her off guard. The afternoon sun hit the glass just right, and for a moment, she saw herself as he might have seen her now. Not the villain, not the socialite, not the destroyer. Just a woman alone with her choices, and finally, aware of them. She whispered the words aloud, her voice trembling slightly. They rebuild. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passing, people walking. The sound of life indifferent to her private reckoning. That evening, she scrolled through her phone, half out of habit, half out of nostalgia. A notification caught her eye. A local veterans charity event organized by the Real Men Do Cry Foundation. She hesitated for a long time before clicking Attend anonymously. The venue was simple, warm, wooden tables, fairy lights strung between beams, families laughing, the same humble energy that had once surrounded Richard everywhere he went. Laura kept to the back, wrapped in a beige coat, her face half hidden beneath a scarf. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. Watching the volunteers, seeing Derek and Chloe move confidently among the crowd, was enough. A short video played on a screen at the front of the hall, showing Richard's voice, narrating over clips of new homes being built across the country. We build not because we're unbroken, but because we refuse to stay broken. Laura felt her throat tighten. She pressed a hand against her chest, breathing through it. Around her, people clapped, laughed, smiled, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir that wasn't bitterness or regret. When she finally stepped outside, the cool night air met her with softness. The city lights shimmered across her eyes as she paused near the street, the faintest hint of a smile forming at the corners of her mouth. Not joy, not forgiveness, but something in between. As she walked away, the camera would linger on that small, fleeting expression, the first genuine one she'd worn in years, a subtle redemption. Quiet, earned, human. The first frame opened with silence. Then, slowly, the sound of rain filled the speakers, soft, rhythmic, familiar. The camera panned down to a dimly lit steakhouse table, where a younger Richard Hale once sat with his trembling hands over a check labeled Tip $0. The title faded in, stark and elegant against the dark screen, Blueprints of Tears. The streaming service had outdone itself. Every detail, every rise, every fall was reconstructed with precision. The documentary wasn't dramatized or sensationalized. It was human. It was raw. Clips flowed seamlessly. The public divorce dinner, the pawn shop scene, the letter from Evelyn Parker's trust, the moment he stood before the trustees with blueprints in hand. The voiceover guided the story, not Richard's voice, but the steady narration of a reporter who'd followed his life from the sidelines. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He built. Archival footage rolled. Grainy cell phone videos, news reports, interviews. The screen split between Laura's early mockery and the footage of Richard on construction sites, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused. Then came the turning point, the announcement of the Veterans Housing Project, the laughter and cheers at the dedication ceremony, the words etched into the plaque, built with tears and steel. In living rooms across the country, viewers watched with rapt attention. For some, it was inspiration. For others, confession. Every segment revealed another truth, that strength wasn't the absence of emotion, but its transformation. Clips of his children followed, Chloe giving a speech about humility, Derek shaking hands with veterans. They spoke of their father not as a legend, but as a compass. "He never punished us for leaving," Chloe said on screen, voice thick with emotion. "He just showed us what it meant to come home." The camera then cut to an aerial drone shot. The Hale Homes community under golden sunlight, rows of rooftops shining like a city of redemption. He built dignity, the narrator said, brick by brick. In small towns and cities, people cried watching it. Veterans wrote letters. Widowers called their sons. Men who hadn't wept in decades sat quietly in the dark, their own reflections trembling on the black screen. The film's impact was immediate. Social media lit up with quotes, screenshots, stills of Richard's stoic face against the backdrop of a half-built home. Hashtags trended worldwide. Dachaura's blueprints of tears. Real men rebuild. Hale legacy. Critics praised it as the most honest documentary of the decade. But while the world watched, Richard wasn't there. He'd been invited, of course. The studio reserved a front-row seat at the New York premiere next to Derek and Chloe. Sam had even called him from the red carpet, laughing into the noise of flashing cameras. "You're missing history, old man," Sam had said through the phone. Richard had smiled faintly. "I've lived it," he replied, and ended the call. Instead, he sat alone on the deck of his Lake Tahoe cabin, wrapped in a wool coat, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky shifted from gold to deep violet, the reflection rippling across the lake's glass surface. On the radio beside him, the broadcast of the premiere played faintly. The narrator's final line echoed through the quiet. He built dignity brick by brick, not for applause, not for legacy, but because rebuilding was the only honest way to live. Richard's eyes softened as he listened. He tilted his head back slightly, the wind tugging at his gray hair. In the fading light, his expression wasn't pride, it was peace. Somewhere in the city, applause erupted as the credits rolled. But here, there was only the sound of water lapping against the dock and the slow, rhythmic creak of wood beneath his chair. The orchestral score began to rise, strings and piano merging into something warm and eternal. Richard looked toward the horizon, where the last trace of sunlight shimmered across the lake. He whispered quietly, almost to himself, "We build because we must." The music swelled gently, the camera pulling back to reveal the wide stillness of the landscape, the man, the cabin, the bridge he'd designed now standing in the distance, illuminated by the last breath of daylight. Fade to black. The morning light spilled through the cabin window like liquid gold, cutting across the wooden floorboards and illuminating the desk where Richard Hale sat for the last time. Outside, Lake Tahoe was calm, the surface smooth as glass, reflecting a world that finally seemed balanced. He adjusted his glasses and opened the thick, leather-bound ledger that had followed him through every chapter of his life. The same ledger that had once been filled with construction expenses, debts, and the daily costs of survival. Over the years, its pages had evolved, becoming less about numbers and more about lessons. About the debts that couldn't be paid in cash. The pen felt heavy in his hand, worn smooth by decades of use. He flipped to the final blank page, staring at it for a long time before writing. His handwriting was slower now, deliberate but steady. Debt settled, interest forgiven. He read the words twice, then underlined forgiven once, not out of habit, but out of finality. There was nothing more to calculate, nothing left owed. As he set the pen down, he heard footsteps on the porch. The door opened with the familiar creak of old wood, and Derek stepped inside. He looked older now, his father's build, his mother's eyes, but calmer than Richard had ever seen him. "Thought I'd find you here," Derek said, smiling faintly. "Chloe sent me, said you weren't answering your phone again." Richard gestured to the view. "Would you, if you had this?" Derek laughed softly, then walked over to the desk. His gaze fell on the open ledger. "Still writing?" "Always," Richard said. "But this is the last page." He closed the book halfway, fingers resting on the cover, then looked up at his son. "You know," he said, "when I started this thing, I thought it was about numbers, profits, losses, building something people could see, but it was never about that. It was about balance. Derek leaned against the edge of the desk. "You found it then?" Richard nodded slowly. "Took longer than I planned, cost more than I thought. But yes." He lifted the ledger, weighing it in his hands one last time, then offered it to Derek. "For the next generation to balance." For a moment, Derek didn't move. He just looked at the book, then at his father, realizing what it meant. This wasn't inheritance. It was responsibility, legacy. He took it with both hands. "I'll keep it safe." Richard shook his head slightly. "Don't keep it. Use it. Add to it. Make your own entries." They stood there for a long moment, two men who had once been strangers bound by pride, now quietly connected by understanding. Then Derek reached forward and pulled his father into a hug. It wasn't awkward this time. It wasn't out of guilt or obligation. It was simple, full, and real. When they stepped back, neither spoke. There was no need. Richard returned to his chair. The pen rolled slightly on the desk, leaving a faint smudge of ink near the words, "Interest forgiven." He noticed it, but didn't correct it. It felt right. Human, imperfect, true. The camera would move closer now, zooming in on that small imperfection. The tiny blot that symbolized everything Richard had learned. The perfection was sterile, but mistakes had character. He closed the ledger gently, the soft thud echoing through the quiet cabin. Then he exhaled, long and slow, like a man finally putting down a weight he'd carried for too many miles. The sunlight shifted, spilling across the desk and catching the edge of the ledger's cover. Dust motes floated lazily through the light, dancing in the air like memories made visible. Outside, the lake shimmered. A bird skimmed the surface and vanished into the horizon. Richard leaned back, watching the reflection of light crawl across the room. His face was still, peaceful, not triumphant, not mournful, just complete. The shot would linger there, the soft creak of the chair, the warmth of the morning, the quiet hum of a man who had finally balanced his life's ledger, and as the camera pulled back, the faintest smile touched his lips. Peace, full circle, resolution. The ballroom of the Hale Foundation glowed with soft amber light, the kind that made everything feel timeless. A year had passed since Richard Hale had signed the Global Charter, and tonight, the organization was celebrating not expansion, not wealth, but impact. Banners read, "Hale Vision Gala, a year of rebuilding humanity." The hall buzzed with quiet pride. Veterans in clean suits, widowers in tailored jackets, construction workers in their Sunday best. At every table sat someone whose life had been touched by the foundation. On stage, a silk curtain hid the centerpiece of the night, a new plaque yet to be revealed. Derek stood at the podium, the same confident posture his father had once carried, but softened by gratitude. "When Dad started this," he began, his voice strong and warm, "he didn't set out to build an empire. He set out to build dignity. Tonight, we dedicate this award to the spirit that made it possible." He gestured toward Chloe, who joined him at the microphone. Her dress was understated, her voice steady. The Hale Vision Award honors not just those who build, but those who rebuild. For the men who faced loss, doubt, or failure and decided that crying wasn't weakness, it was the blueprint. The audience murmured, moved. Cameras flashed, recording every word. Derek smiled, then added, "This first award goes to someone who showed us all that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build in others." The crowd turned as the curtain dropped. Behind it, the plaque gleamed in gold under the lights. The engraving read, "The Hale Vision Award for men who cried and built again." The applause began softly, then rose into thunder. From the back of the hall, Richard Hale stepped forward. His hair had gone fully silver, but his stride was steady, deliberate. The audience parted as he walked down the aisle, applause surrounding him like a tide. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. Derek stood taller, pride breaking through his composure. Noah, barely 13 now, beamed beside them, holding a small trophy of his own. Richard reached the stage slowly, each step measured, each breath visible. The applause didn't fade. It only grew, echoing through the grand hall until it was less sound and more heartbeat. He paused at the edge of the stage, gazing at the plaque, reading the inscription once, twice. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished metal, a man made whole by the very thing that once broke him. When he finally faced the crowd, the room quieted instantly. No music, no movement, just him. He took the microphone from Derek and looked directly into the audience. The silence was reverent. "Never mock tears," he said, voice low but resonant, "because they water strength." The words hung in the air, suspended like a vow. Then came the applause, fierce, unrestrained, cathartic. Veterans stood, builders whistled, even reporters wiped at their eyes, cameras catching their own reflection in the gold light of the plaque. Derek stepped behind his father and placed a hand on his shoulder. Chloe joined, linking arms with them both. Noah looked up at his grandfather with the kind of admiration only a boy who'd seen transformation could carry. Together, they faced the audience, a family no longer fractured, but forged in renewal. Behind them, a large screen flickered to life, displaying a montage: the first house built after the divorce, the courtroom scene, the veterans' community, the Lake Tahoe bridge glistening under snowfall. The final frame froze on a photograph of Richard standing by that lake, pen in hand, sketching the future. The orchestral score swelled softly, strings, piano, and a faint choir blending in harmony. Richard turned slightly, glancing toward his family, then back at the audience. His expression was peaceful, almost amused. The man who once trembled over a restaurant check now stood, as the architect of grace itself. As the applause continued, the lights dimmed to a golden hue. The camera panned out, capturing the scene in wide frame, the family, the plaque, the shimmering hall, filled with lives rebuilt. Then, seamlessly, the image transitioned, gold light washing into the sunrise over Lake Tahoe. The bridge gleamed faintly in the distance, and the sound of gentle waves replaced the applause. On-screen text appeared, fading in slowly like the end of a timeless story. Revenge built on tears, resolved in legacy. The final note of the orchestra lingered, a single, resonant chord. Then silence,